Hello, fellow Sapiens, and a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're wrapped in a blanket on a long winter night, driving home through soft rain, or drifting slowly towards sleep, this space is for you. Because tonight, we are stepping into a time when shelter meant survival, and survival meant building warmth from the bones of giants. This is slow storytelling for ancient minds and cold skies. What follows is a nearly forgotten chapter in the history of shelter, from 26,000 years ago, when the wind carved silence across the mammoth steppe. But it is not a tale of cave dwellers and firelight. It is the story of families who built houses without wood, who engineered warmth from tusks and hide, and who left behind circles of bone to mark the place where they endured. And, if you are the kind of human who finds peace in deep time and mystery, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this quiet kind of science reach others who may need it too. I wonder where you are listening from tonight. What country? What city? What hour? If you feel like sharing that in the comments, it helps remind us that we are listening together, even across ages. And, if your eyes begin to close as the story unfolds, that is completely fine. Chapters and timestamps are in the description. Now, let us begin with a silence carried by wind. How did Ice Age families build warm shelters from scratch? That is the question at the center of our story. Not just how they stayed alive, but how they created warmth in a world shaped by cold. 26,000 years ago, during the coldest phase of the Last Glacial Maximum, there were no bricks, no wood beams, no blueprints or saws. There were only hands, bones, skins, fire, and the quiet resolve of people who refused to freeze. This is not the story of civilization. It is the story before civilization, when the stakes were simpler but no less profound. Warmth was not comfortable. It was the difference between waking up and never waking again. In the depth of winter, on the open mammoth steppe, a shelter was not a building. It was an act of defiance against wind that never stopped, and cold that came not in days, but in centuries. The land was vast, almost endless. A treeless grassland that spanned from what is now France to the edge of Siberia. Scientists call it the mammoth steppe, a super biome that stretched across the northern hemisphere during the Upper Paleolithic. It was dry, windswept, bleak, but not empty. Herds of mammoths moved across it. Reindeer, bison, woolly rhino. In the colder latitudes, the ground never fully thawed. Permafrost locked the soil in place. There were few trees, and fewer that grew tall enough to offer useful timber. In most directions, there was only low grass and sky. This was the world our ancestors faced. They had tools, yes. They had fire. But they did not have buildings, no stone villages, no log cabins. They had to make shelter from what the land gave them. And what the land gave was hard to carry. Heavy. Unforgiving. A mammoth femur could weigh more than an adult human. And yet, this is what they used. We know this not from stories. We know it from clues. In the soil of Ukraine, Russia, and Central Europe, archaeologists have uncovered patterns. Rings of bone, massive arcs of tusk, hearths surrounded by curved walls of mammoth jaw. These are not random piles. They are arranged with intention, circular, enclosed, and scorched from within. This suggests fire. It suggests people. It suggests that someone, thousands of years ago, decided that even on a steppe without trees, they could still build a home. But before we reach the bones, we have to sit with the cold, to feel what they felt. Because the real mystery is not how the structures were made. It is how people endured long enough to imagine building them in the first place. What was it like to wake into a wind that scoured the skin? To gather snow that refused to melt? To watch your breath freeze in the air before it reaches the end of a sentence? To begin answering that, we have to understand the climate itself. The last glacial maximum peaked around 26,000 years ago. It was not a sudden event. It had been building for millennia. Ice sheets advanced across the northern continents, locking away fresh water and lowering global sea levels. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall patterns shifted. In many places, what was once forest became tundra, and what was tundra became barren ground. Europe did not vanish under ice, but much of it came close. Scandinavia was a frozen shield. The British Isles were largely uninhabitable. Central and Eastern Europe became the edge of what scientists call the Scandinavian ice sheet. South of it, where the steppe remained open, the climate was brutally dry and cold. Even in the summer months, warmth was fleeting. The wind was constant. It moved across the plains with such force that even small particles of soil were carried in suspension, grinding and scouring everything they touched. There were no trees to cut. In most places, there are no forests to enter. A few low-growing willows or dwarf birch may have clung to river valleys, but for the most part, wood was a rare and precious material. That meant no logs to stack, no branches to lash, no walls to carve from trunks. In this environment, shelter could not begin with timber. It had to begin with something else. The mammoth steppe was dominated by animals, not plants. The soil was hard, but not frozen to its core. It could be dug, it could be shaped, but the materials that stood above ground were bones. Tusks, hides. Families hunted megafauna not only for food, but for structure. When a mammoth was killed, it provided meat, fat, fuel, and warmth. But it also left behind pieces of shelter. Some scientists have found evidence of hidden tents staked directly into the earth. Others propose that snow and ice were packed against frames to create windbreaks. But the most extraordinary remains are the bone circles. These are large, circular arrangements of mammoth bones, sometimes 10 meters across, with signs of repeated use and repair. They are not random middens, they are deliberate. What makes these shelters remarkable is not only their scale, but their location. They are often found on open plains, exposed to wind from every direction. That tells us something about planning, about the ability to position walls in the path of prevailing gusts, to build doorways that face away from the coldest flows. In this, we glimpse a kind of architecture that did not require cities or writing. It required only memory, observation, and time. So how do we piece together the lives of the people who built these places? What does it mean to build warmth when the world is cold? And what do we look for in the frozen soil of Eastern Europe to know when shelter has been found? Not just a place to crouch, but a place to last the winter. To see that clearly, we have to turn to the bones themselves. At sites like Mezrich in Ukraine and Kostenki near the Don River, archaeologists have uncovered what appear to be foundations of Ice Age homes. The outlines are unmistakable. Mammoth jawbones arranged in a near-perfect circle, massive tusks arched across the ground, long bones set upright, as if marking walls. These patterns are too ordered to be accidental. They speak of hands at work, of minds solving problems with what little the world would allow. Some of these structures contain more than 100 individual mammoth bones. That means more than one mammoth per shelter. Possibly many more. The bones are sorted by type. Skulls are grouped in clusters. Ribs are used like beams. Pelvises flattened into broad panels. This suggests not just function, but design. Someone knew which bone would hold weight, which ones could shield against wind, which would make a stable ring. Inside these rings, scientists have found signs of life. Charcoal, burned bone, flakes of stone left from tool making, and in some cases, carefully buried objects. Ivory carvings, beads, a polished stone. These are not things you drop in passing. These are the things you carry with you, the things you keep near fire. In the center of one such ring, researchers discovered a hearth, charcoal and ash, surrounded by cracked stones and bone blackened by heat. The fire had burned long enough to leave a signature, a core of warmth, and around it, the evidence suggests, people gathered. They cooked, they sharpened blades, they told stories. Though the stories are lost, we cannot know the full shape of the shelter that once stood above those bones. The hides are gone, the roofs have collapsed, but there are clues. The arc of holes around the perimeter might once have held stakes. The pattern of soot suggests a smoke hole or vent. The inner edge of the bone wall is worn smooth in places. That could mean it was touched often. Sat against. Perhaps children leaned there as they watched the fire. The scale of these shelters raises a question. Who lived in them? Were they homes for a single family? Or did they hold larger groups? The space enclosed would have been enough for several people. A winter camp, perhaps. Or a seasonal home used during the coldest months. The answer is not clear. But what is clear is that this was not a structure for a night or two. It was meant to last. Imagine the labor, the the cold air slicing across your skin as you haul a femur half your size, the numb hands gripping a stone blade as you carve holes through permafrost, the way breath crystallizes in front of your face as you work in silence. These shelters were not easy. They were not quick. They were chosen, built deliberately, which means they mattered, which leads to a deeper question. What did warmth feel like when it was made from the bones of something that once tried to kill you? What did warmth feel like when it was made from the bones of something that once tried to kill you? That question lingers as we picture the stillness of those winter camps. The shelters were not just physical spaces, they were psychological ones. Boundaries between danger and safety, between open steppe and enclosed breath. Outside was cold, loud, and exposed. Inside was muted, dim, filled with the smells of ash and hide and smoke. The walls absorbed sound, or at least softened it. Thick bones and layered hides dulled the howling wind. Fire flickered low and steady, its light cast against curved tusks and polished stones. In such a place, a whisper could feel like a moment of power, a choice to speak in the hush of survival. And to listen was to remember that you were not alone. The bones themselves may have had meanings we cannot recover. Were they chosen for shape or for memory? Did some come from animals hunted by the family? Did the builders know which bone belonged to which kill? It is possible. In some sites, the bones appear freshly cleaned. In others, they seem scavenged, worn, carried far. There is evidence of modification, not just carving, but shaping. Mammoth ribs shaved to fit into place. Tusk segments notched for lashing. This tells us the builders were not just piling bones, they were assembling structures with intent. That matters, because it means these were not makeshift camps thrown up in a storm. They were not mere improvisations. They were shelters shaped with memory, repetition, perhaps even tradition, passed down from one winter to the next. And the cold outside was not passive. It was not simply a background condition. It was the main force they worked against. Temperatures may have dropped to levels few of us now experience, well below freezing, day after day. Nights where frostbite came in minutes. Wind speeds that made fire difficult to maintain. Snow was so dry and fine that it could pass through seams in the hide. To survive this required more than fire. It required insulation. Bone walls stacked thick, hides layered and weighted with stones. Entrances narrowed to preserve heat. Some researchers believe that snow was used as a second layer, packed against the outside walls for added insulation. If true, these shelters were not only homes, they were domes of deliberate engineering, created without blueprints, without writing, without nails or hinges, only with knowledge carried in the mind. That knowledge would have been local, inherited, learned through years of watching wind patterns and animal behavior, through building, failing, freezing, trying again. This kind of learning does not leave much behind, but we catch its outline in the way bones form circles. In this way, hearths always sit in the center, in the way a structure aligns with the direction of the wind. All of it points to the same conclusion. These people knew what they were doing. These people knew what they were doing. They were not stumbling through survival by accident. They were practicing cold wisdom. One passed not through words, but through repetition, through gestures, through the quiet act of choosing which bone to lift and where to place it. And then doing it again the next year, or showing a child how to do it with smaller hands. What remains in the ground now is fragmentary, but from those fragments, we can infer a rhythm of life, a cycle not just of hunting and eating, but of returning to the same ridge, the same riverbank, the same pattern of bone that once marked safety in a landscape that offered none. This is not just the archaeology of structure. It is the archaeology of memory, because what is shelter, if not a memory of warmth? A space held against time, against the weather, against forgetting. In the most literal sense, these people built memory into the earth. They dug posts into the frozen ground. They shaped walls out of things that had once moved and breathed. They were created inside space, in a world defined by outside. We may never know their names. We will not recover their language, but we can see what they chose to preserve. Circles, fire pits, openings that faced east, perhaps to greet the Sunday. Stones arranged in ways that suggest deliberate layout. The faintest trace of soot where the smoke must have risen, and through this, we can begin to feel their presence, not as primitive survivors, but as engineers of endurance. Their solutions were shaped by constraint. They could not build up, so they built in. They could not chop wood, so they curved the bone. They could not stop the wind, but they could learn to face away from it. The mammoth steppe did not care for them. It offered no protection, no mercy, but it gave just enough material. And in those harsh conditions, that was enough. Enough to try, enough to build, enough to create a pocket of heat and breath in a frozen world. That is the story of an Ice Age shelter. Not one of architectural marvels or grand construction, but one of persistence. Of bodies huddled close to fire. Of walls made thick with time and effort. Of warmth crafted from the remnants of beasts, a story built from scratch when the world offered almost nothing, and yet they made something. Something that could hold back the wind. Something that could last through the longest night. Something that, 26,000 years later, still leaves its shape in the soil. So what else might be waiting, buried in the permafrost and dust? What other shelters are hidden just beneath the surface, silent in the wind, still holding the memory of those who once called them home? And how do we listen to that silence without expecting it to speak? How do we hear what warmth sounded like when it was built from cold? That question guides us deeper into the soil, where silence becomes shape. Because even now, buried beneath silt and frost, we find circles that once held the breath of families. Circles made not of stone or wood, but of bone. The bones of giants. Across the vast lands once swept by the Ice Age wind, archaeologists have uncovered these rings. Each one is unique, each one deliberate. The most well-known lie in what is now Ukraine, in a small village called Mezyryk. Others rest in the Russian plains of Kostenki, and further still, in places like Udinovo and Gonci, where the ground still holds the curve of tusks turned to walls. At first glance, these rings might be mistaken for the remnants of butchery. Scattered bones, splintered shafts, crushed skulls. But the patterns argue otherwise. They form arcs, repeating segments, boundaries. In Mezyryk, 4 structures have been uncovered so far, each made from the remains of more than 100 mammoths. That is not an accident. That is architecture. The largest of these rings measures over 10 meters across. That is more than enough space to house several people, maybe a family, maybe more. But it is not only the size that matters, it is the arrangement. Bones are grouped by type, skulls along one section, ribs stacked near the base, jawbones are lined into a low wall, tusks set to arch above entry points. In some cases, the bones are cut and shaped, modified to fit, balanced to bear weight. This is not a random discard. This is construction. We can only imagine what the full shelter looked like when it stood complete. The hides are gone, the roofs have vanished. But there are hints. Charcoal stains in the center suggest hearths. Scatters of flint flakes point to tool-making. The occasional worked ivory bead or pierced tooth tells us that someone lived there. Not briefly, not by chance, but with continuity. At Kostenki, the evidence is older. Some sites date back more than 30,000 years. Others are closer to 20,000. The layers vary, but the intent is shared. There too are circular patterns of mammoth bone. There too are signs of fire. There too we find the silent echo of shelter. The materials tell their own story. A single adult mammoth yields hundreds of kilograms of bone. No small thing to move, especially in the cold wind and uneven snow. The fact that these bones were carried, placed, and shaped suggests coordination, memory, repetition, and perhaps even something else. Why build with bones? Why take the hardest part of the hunt and make it the boundary of your warmth? Was it simply a necessity? Or was it something more? Something symbolic? Something remembered? To understand that, we have to look inside the rings themselves, not just at the bones, but at what they contain. What lies within the circle tells us who was there, and what they left behind when they moved on. Inside these shelters, the clues are faint but persistent. A thin layer of charcoal, burnt mammoth bones cracked from heat, soot-blackened stone, All of it points to fire. Not wildfire, not destruction, but controlled, purposeful fire. Hearths that were used repeatedly. Fires that warmed bodies, dried hides, cooked meat, and kept predators at bay. Each hearth tells its own quiet story. In some cases, the ash is concentrated in the center. In others, it is offset, suggesting a second source of light or heat. Around the fire, archaeologists find flint flakes. These are the shards left behind when someone shaped a tool, or resharpened a blade dulled by scraping hide or splitting bone. The flakes form clusters, patterns. They tell us that someone knelt there, someone worked, someone paused. There are signs of meals, not full bones, but fragments, cracked open for marrow, burned at the tips, discarded in heaps, a mammoth toe, a reindeer scapula, sometimes fish bones, sometimes birds, all of it mingled with charcoal and flint. There is no script, no diary, but the scatter of these remains forms a kind of record, a frozen rhythm of daily life. In some shelters, there is evidence of internal divisions, low ridges of bone separating one side of the circle from another, perhaps to block wind, or to mark space. Sleeping areas, storage piles, a place to keep tools from being trampled. We cannot be sure, but the shapes are there, and the choices they suggest point to a lived space, a structured life. There is beauty, too. Among the flakes and ash, archaeologists have found objects that serve no obvious function. A polished stone that fits in the palm, a pierced fox tooth, a fragment of ivory shaped into a tiny figurine. Some of these are decorated, others simply smoothed. They are not tools. They are not a waste. They are something else. Perhaps ornaments, perhaps talismans, perhaps nothing more than idle art, made in a moment of stillness. At Mezerich, one of the most extraordinary finds was not a tool or a weapon. It was the jawbone of a mammoth, placed upright and used as a container. Inside it were stones, small tools, bits of ochre. It may have been a storage pit, or an altar, or simply a way to keep sharp things from freezing to the ground. Whatever the purpose, the gesture is unmistakable. Someone used what they had to create order, and that is what shelter really island. Not just protection from the wind, but the shaping of space, a way to say this is inside, this is ours, and this is where we begin again. How long they stayed, how often they returned, how many winters those bones had seen. These are the quiet questions we continue to ask. Most of the mammoth bone shelters we know were not permanent homes. The evidence suggests something more fluid, more seasonal. These were places to return to, places to endure winter, or to wait for the herds to pass. Some structures show signs of repair, reused bones, hearths built atop older hearths, stone tools scattered in layers, the kind of accumulation that speaks not of a single visit, but of memory, of recognition, the quiet knowledge that this circle once held fire and could hold it again. There is a sense of patience in this pattern. The cold may have driven them away, the melt may have swept snow through the seams, but the bones remained, too heavy to drift, too stable to scatter. When people returned, they found their own past waiting. The same arch of tusks, the same smooth jawbone once pressed against the hide. They did not need to start over. They only needed to begin again. At Udinovo, scientists uncovered a structure with multiple layers of use. Adjacent to the ring were pits filled with mammoth bone. These were not laid out in careful arcs. They were collected, stored, possibly as future material, possibly for tools, or possibly for walls yet to be rebuilt. This suggests forethought, a plan not just for today, but for tomorrow, a memory held not only in mind, but in place. And these shelters were rarely alone. In some sites, several bone circles sit close together, not scattered randomly, but placed with intention. A cluster, a small constellation of shelter. Whether they were occupied at once or over time, we do not know, but their nearness suggests more than coincidence. Perhaps different families sharing a seasonal camp, perhaps one group returning again and again, following the same internal map. Spatial alignment adds another layer to the story. Entrances tend to face southeast, not always, but often enough to notice. Was this to catch morning light, or to avoid the bitterest winds, or both? The answer is uncertain, but the consistency is there, across distances, across generations. This is not guesswork. It is an adaptation, a form of architectural memory shaped by exposure, and perhaps by habit, the kind passed down through practice, through watching, through helping stake the first hide to the bone ring, and hearing someone older say not like that, but like this. We do not hear the words, but we can see the repetition. These are not the blueprints of civilization. They are something quieter, something that comes before, a form of order drawn not with ink, but with bone, pressed into snow, marked by fire. When we find these circles in the ground, we are not just looking at shelter, we are looking at knowledge, stored in rings, passed through silence, held in place by the cold, and that knowledge was not theoretical. It was physical. It was tested every time the wind blew, every time the fire burned low, every time a child cried in the night, and someone reached to pull the hide tighter over the gap in the wall. What we learn from these shelters is not only how they were built, but how they were used. Their shape is not just a response to climate, it is a response to life, to the rhythm of eating and sleeping, of working and watching. Inside these circles, the remains of daily life build up like sediment, tool fragments, burned bones, shaped ivory, a rhythm of movement and stillness. Some shelters contain distinct zones, areas with heavier flint scatter, areas with higher concentrations of ash, others with animal bones, and nothing more. These may have been activity spaces, or sleeping areas, or simply the result of habits formed over time. We cannot be certain, but the patterns suggest that space was organized, that there was structure within the circle, not imposed by walls, but created by the people who lived there. There are places where tools cluster near hearths, not by accident, but by need, where the light was best, where the warmth held longest, where hands worked flint into blades while others cooked marrow-rich bone, and across from that, perhaps, a quieter space, where children slept, or stories were told. Our elders sat with eyes half closed, watching the sparks climb into the cold dark. In some structures, scientists have identified upright bones that may have served as posts, anchoring points for roofs, for hides stretched tight, for snow packed atop for insulation. These are not ruins in the modern sense. There are no walls left standing, no doors to open, but the logic of construction remains. A bone is not just a thing. It is a line, a support, a surface, a shadow cast by firelight, and the choice of bones is not random. Tusks are curved but strong. Skulls are wide and heavy. Jawbones can be stacked or propped. Each has a shape, a weight, a resistance. The people who built these shelters knew those qualities, not from books, but from touch, from repetition, from watching bones break under pressure, or hold under snow. There is something deeply human in that relationship. Not reverence, not dominance, but familiarity. A kind of rough partnership with the mammoth even after death. To hunt an animal and then to live within its ribs. That is not just survival, that is transformation. And through that transformation, they built something more than a wall. They built a space for returning. A space that turned the vast steppe into something momentarily still. Momentarily theirs. The scale of these constructions is easy to underestimate. To build even one circle required more than strength. It demanded time, coordination, decision-making, not just how to place the bones, but which ones to carry, which to leave, which to bury in the earth, and which to raise toward the sky. These were not random acts, they were sequences, rituals of movement, shaped by cold and memory. Some of the bones show cut marks, others are polished, smooth from wear. Some were burned deliberately, perhaps to harden them, perhaps as fuel when wood was scarce. We often forget that bones can burn. That marrow is fat, that collagen makes flame. In these places, even the walls could become fuel if the fire dimmed, and no other source remained. And yet, for the most part, the structures held. That is what the evidence shows, not just in their shape, but in their persistence. Tens of thousands of years have passed, but the rings remain, flattened, weathered, faint. Still, they hold their form, a geometry that defies time. a logic strong enough to survive the melt, the soil, the forgetting. In the soil beneath each ring is a history of use, layers of ash, tool debris, discarded bones from countless meals, a stratigraphy of survival. A record not carved into stone, but pressed into earth. Scientists read these layers like pages, each one a season, a return, a small decision repeated enough times to leave a mark. And in that accumulation, something remarkable happens. The shelters become more than shelters. They become archives, not of ideas, but of actions, of moments. A flake of flint caught near a hearth, a burned fish vertebra pressed into loam, a pierced shell dropped in sleep. These are not symbols, they are evidence. They are what remains when everything else is gone. We do not know the names of the people who lived in these circles, but we know they knew how to read the wind, how to place a rib to catch it, how to angle an entrance so that snow would not drift too deep. We know they are built thick, and low, and strong, and we know that they returned. The mammoth bone circles tell us more than how people lived. They tell us how people learned, how they adapted, how they remembered not with words, but with patterns, with place, with motion. In that, they left behind not just footprints, but an entire language of shelter, spoken in bone, heard in silence, and so the question lingers. What kind of humans built walls out of giants? What did they see when they stood inside the circle and looked toward the horizon, toward the mammoth, toward the cold, toward each other? And what did they understand that we have forgotten? In the quiet outline of a circle made from bones, there is a question not only of memory, but of possibility. When the trees vanish, when the wind deepens, when the earth hardens beneath a layer of ice, and the forests retreat like shadows at dusk, what does it mean to build? What does it mean to shelter? The haunting question that sits at the center of this chapter is simple. What does construction look like when wood is gone? Because in the world of the Last Glacial Maximum, it was not scarcity that made humans inventive. It was a necessity. The steppe stretched from the edges of Western Europe to the far eastern reaches of Siberia. An ocean of grass, frozen most of the year, windblown, treeless, wide. An open biome that left little room for error. This was not a world of lush river valleys or dense boreal forests. It was a land of extremes. The temperature could dip below -20 degrees Celsius. Snow would drift in mounds taller than a man, and the only vertical silhouettes against the sky were mammoths. Wood was precious, rare, sometimes carried from far away, but not the foundation of architecture. So the people who lived here, families with children, elders, and the sick, turned to something more enduring. The remains of the very animals that gave them food and heat. Mammoth bones. These were not symbols, they were solutions. A single mammoth could leave behind hundreds of kilograms of bone, ribs longer than a person, tusks curved like slow rivers, pelvises wide enough to lie beneath, and skulls that could be leaned like slabs against a wall of snow. What the archaeological record shows, from sites like Mezirik and Udinovo in Ukraine to others scattered across central Russia, is a pattern of adaptive engineering that begins not with design, but with constraint. There were no trees to fell, no branches to lash, no logs to shape, but there were bones. Bones that had been cleaned, dried, and stacked. Bones that had already survived tens of thousands of winters in the bodies of giants. Scientists believe that these shelters began with circular rings of ribs and skulls, dug slightly into the ground for stability. The bones were likely arranged by size and curvature. Ribs placed to form a low perimeter wall, jaws and scapulae fitted between them like pieces in a great icy puzzle. The larger bones provided anchor points. The smaller ones filled gaps. Snow was used as sealant, hide as roof, intelligence as mortar. This was not abstract architecture. This was bodily. It was felt through fingers stiff with cold, through backs sore from carrying, through days spent testing where a bone would lean, and nights spent listening to the creak of wind outside. These were shelters that grew from constraint, not abundance, from listening to what the land refused to give, and choosing instead to build from what remained. A bone is not a beam. It is not straight. It is not uniform. It curves. It tapers. It thickens in the middle. It cracks when stressed in the wrong place. But if you know a bone well enough, you stop asking it to act like wood. You start asking it to act like itself. That shift in thinking is the foundation of Ice Age engineering. The people of the mammoth steppe did not shape the bone to match an imagined design. They shaped the design around the bone. The curve of a rib became a natural arch. The slope of a tusk became a buttress. The socket of a femur became the perfect cradle for a joint of hide or a wedge of snow. Each element was chosen for what it already was, not what it could be made into. This is the essence of load-bearing instinct. To feel the difference between tension and compression. To stack wide bones low. To lean narrow bones high. To brace from the inside. Not because of formulas, but because of failure, because of memory, because someone tried it once, and it broke, and they did it differently the next time. And though we think of these shelters as singular rings, they were rarely simple. Some show signs of multi-walled construction, double rings, a corridor leading inward. Others may have had conical roofs, hide stretched over bone supports, snow packed on top to trap heat. The interiors could have been surprisingly warm. The fire in the center would heat the air. The thick bones and snow walls would insulate it. Body heat would rise, and the cold outside would stay where it belonged. Inside, space had to be managed. A hearth at the center, sleeping areas along the sides, storage for food, for tools, for hides that needed drying. There may have been layers of bedding branches when they could be found, animal skins when they could not. Layers of snow were sometimes used to build shelves, raised areas to keep food from freezing solid, or to keep it away from animals. All of this speaks not only to intelligence, but to experience, to trial and error, to communal knowledge passed not in words, but in action, a way of arranging the world that had to be learned young. Help your mother fit the tusk into the rib gap. Watch how your father patches the hole in the roof with frozen hide. Learn by doing, then do it by knowing. This was not improvisation. It was a system, not written down, but remembered, not perfect, but effective. Every shelter built with bone was a response, to wind, to space, to time, and to a silence that asked no questions, but demanded answers anyway. In glacial Eurasia, the wind did not whisper. It roared. It scoured the plains. It reshaped snowbanks and erased tracks. It slipped through gaps and sought out warmth. Any structure built here had to do more than stand. It had to resist. It had to contain heat and exclude cold. It had to become a second skin for the family within. Without wood, that challenge became a question of pressure and distribution, not beams and rafters, but weight and surface. Bones arranged in overlapping circles, skulls packed with snow to fill hollows, hides pulled tight to reduce flutter. These were not designs handed down by architects. They were traditions grown from observation, from the hard-earned certainty that only some bones hold weight well. That snow can insulate if used right. That heat escapes fastest through corners and seams. And it was not only about the structure, it was about the materials that made it possible. A single mammoth could yield enough bone to build a shelter large enough for a small group. But bone alone was not enough. Hide was the seal. Snow was the glue. Fat was the heat. A mammoth hide could weigh hundreds of kilograms. It took many people to carry it, more to stretch it. It had to be thawed in firelight before it could bend. It had to be lashed to bone using sinew or rawhide, pegged down with stones, pinned with splinters of antler or shaped ivory, and once it froze in place, it became tight, impermeable, almost part of the land itself. Snow was more than background, it was material. When packed and frozen, it could form windbreaks, it could fill cracks, it could weigh down a roof so it would not lift in the storm. A wall of snow built against the outside of a bone ring added insulation. A trench cut into the snow around the shelter could divert meltwater. It was not always an enemy. Sometimes it was an ally. Inside, warmth had to be managed. Fire was constant, but not infinite. Fuel was scarce. Bone could burn, but not easily. Dung from herbivores was sometimes dried and used. Small sticks were precious. Any wood found on the steppe carried by rivers or brought from forested fringes was used sparingly. Fires had to be small, efficient, positioned low to heat the air but not waste it, and the people had to be close. Shared body heat was part of survival. Families slept pressed together. Tools were kept within reach. Children were held beneath layers of fur and hide. In such a space, the line between shelter and body blurred. Each wall was a compromise. Each fire is a decision. Each curve of bone is not just a shape, but a strategy. In that frozen world, form was never separate from function. It was survival made visible. And survival, in this place, did not mean holding out alone. It meant sharing knowledge, skills, materials. The mammoth steppe was not empty. It was vast, but it was known. Families moved across it in seasonal arcs. Sometimes near rivers, sometimes across high ground where winds kept snow from drifting too deep. Wherever they stopped, they left traces. And sometimes they returned. The shelters built in these places became part of that memory. Bone rings buried beneath snow, a broken tusk jutting from the white, a familiar shape half visible in the wind. These places were not permanent in the modern sense, but they lasted, and they were known. In a landscape with few landmarks, the shelter itself became the marker. Some sites show layers of reuse, hearths rebuilt in the same place, new tools among old bones. A second wall was added beside the first. These were not accidental returns. They were planned, or remembered, or both. The spatial arrangements within these camps hint at something larger, not just one shelter, but several, clustered, facing similar directions, or arranged in slight curves. Openings turn toward light, or away from wind. Passageways cut through snow between them. Communal zones, shared tasks, a network of knowledge distributed across the camp. It suggests that architecture was not only practical, it was social. Where one shelter stood, another might rise beside it. Built from the same principles, the same materials, but shaped slightly differently. Adapted for space, for people, for the season. And within each, the interior was more than a container. It was a canvas of activity, the placement of tools, the storage of hides, the way a fire was laid and tended. All of it speaks to a rhythm, a pattern, things done in sequence, not just thrown together, but considered. Scarcity was the teacher, but repetition was the method. People learned to think like the land, to use what lay beneath snow, what had once walked across the steppe, what could be bent or burned or tied. Each shelter was a solution to a specific moment, a point in time, a need. But each also carried echoes of other places, other shelters, a kind of quiet standard that could be reinterpreted but not ignored. This is engineering at its most human, not formalized, but passed along, taught by gesture, confirmed by winter. A structure does not stand long if it is not right, and in this world, to build wrong was not just failure, it was dangerous. That is what gives these shelters their weight. Not just the mammoth bones, not just the snow, but the accumulation of understanding. The way every rib and hide and stone tells us something was figured out. Something worked. Something lasted. Even when the trees were gone. Even when the sky cracked with cold. They built. And they stayed. What we see in these shelters is not the absence of wood. It is the presence of thought, of trial, of an architecture born not in abundance but in refusal. The land refused to give them timber, so they learned to read bones instead. And in that reading, they became fluent in limits. They understood how weight moves through curves, how pressure settles into ground that is frozen, how tension can be distributed across a hide if pulled just right. They did not write these truths. They lived them. The scarcity of glacial Eurasia was not only about materials, it was also about time. The seasons pressed hard. Summer was short. The window to hunt, to gather, to move, to build. It opened and then closed again. And every shelter had to be ready before that door slammed shut. So their engineering had to be fast, but it also had to last. Bones were heavy, hides were thick. The snow was unforgiving. Each piece had to be worth the effort. Each step in construction is shaped by urgency, yes, but also by care, and it is this care we feel now. Thousands of years later, as archaeologists uncover rings of bone, hearths preserved beneath layers of lows, a jawbone still leaning against another, a fragment of hide compressed in the soil, each one a signal, a message from people who knew what the wind could do. We call them shelters, but they were more than that. They were containers of memory, frames for firelight, places where laughter might have echoed, where a baby might have taken its first steps on a floor of frozen hide, where someone might have whispered a story while feeding the fire with scraps of dung and bone. And even when they moved on, when the people left for other hunting grounds, for rivers less frozen, for valleys where the mammoth still wandered, these places stayed behind. The bone rings waiting under snow, the silence still held by the curve of a tusk. To live without wood was not to live without shelter. It was to reshape what shelter meant, to strip it to its essentials: warmth, safety, community, a roof that did not fall, a wall that did not drift, a fire that stayed alight through the longest night. And in doing so, they built something quiet and lasting, not grand, but grounded, not ornate, but full of knowledge. What remains today are not ruins. They are remnants of ingenuity, of a people who read the land closely, who answered the cold, not with despair, but with action. In a world without trees, they raised homes from giants. They stitched space from what others might have seen as refuse. They made shelter from the impossible, and they made it last. But lasting was not enough. A ring of bones could block the wind. A hide pulled tight could shield the snow. Yet the cold still seeped in. It wrapped around the body. It whispered through the floor. It settled deep in the lungs. So the question lingers. What was it that made these strange circular homes truly warm? Across the mammoth steppe, in the silence of loess and frost, we find faint clues. Not many, but enough. In Mezhyrich, in Kostenki, in Udinovo. Beneath the rings of tusk and rib, archaeologists have traced something softer. Ash, charcoal, burned bones, a cracked stone hearth. The subtle blackening of earth beneath where people once sat. There is no grand fireplace, no chimney, no carved fire pit with sculpted walls. But the ash is there, layered gently into the soil, evidence that in these shelters, or perhaps just beside them, fires once burned. And not just for cooking, not just for light, but for warmth. A fire changes everything. It dries clothing, softens hides, makes bones easier to split. But most of all, it creates a center, a shared center. In the middle of a shelter made from mammoths, fire turned the interior into something more than survival. It became a place to be. The people of the mammoth steppe were not simply cold-weather wanderers. They were engineers of microclimates, and that is what this ash tells us, that they were thinking not only about walls and wind, but about heat, about airflow, about how to keep smoke out and warmth in. Some bones show signs of thermal cracking, splits and fractures that suggest exposure to heat. Not once, but over time. There are stones found near hearths that may have been used for heat storage, heated in fire, then carried closer to bodies or buried under bedding. These are inferences. The evidence is modest, but the implications are not. To make a home warm in a treeless land required more than fire. It required management. Fires inside hide-covered shelters must be small, controlled. You cannot fill the air with smoke. You cannot let the flames touch the roof. So perhaps they dug shallow pits, or built stone circles, or used mammoth scapulae to line the hearth floor. Perhaps they arranged smoke holes, left gaps in the hide near the apex of the roof. We cannot say for certain, but we can imagine the glow, low, flickering, painting curves of tusk and bone in red and gold. Children curled close to the embers, tools drying in the warmth, ice melting in a carved bowl. The shelter, once only a structure, now had a pulse. And in the dead of winter, that meant everything. Not just survival, but comfort. Not just protection, but the beginning of a home. We often speak of human adaptability, of cleverness. But here, inside these low shelters under an ice age sky, we see something else. Something quieter. The ability to shape warmth from what should have been cold. The discipline to manage fire without timber. The patience to control smoke without a chimney. These were not grand flames. They were careful ones. A hearth is not only a fire. It is a decision. Where to place it. How to feed it. How to live around it. In a space ringed by bone and sealed in hide, that decision mattered. The fire had to be central. But not overwhelming. It had to be small enough not to suffocate, but strong enough to make the air inhabitable. That balance was the line between sleep and frostbite, between waking and not. Excavated hearths from Mezhyrich and Gonsi are often shallow, sometimes just a scatter of charcoal, sometimes a ring of stones the size of a cooking pit, but near them are clues of life. flakes of flint, bones split for marrow, scraps of hide with trace stitching. These were not only fires, they were places of doing, of eating, of making. Ceilings within these structures were likely low, measured to trap heat rather than allow it to rise. Some may have been little taller than a sitting adult, others slightly higher near the center, enough space to cook, to pass tools, to speak without raising voices. The ceilings may have been hidden, stretched tight, but over time, soot would build. Smoke from 100 nights would darken the interior, turn the inner space from ivory white to brown, from bone to shadow, and yet this soot is a gift. It tells us there was heat, not once, but again and again. It tells us people returned, or stayed, or passed knowledge forward. The ceilings did not blacken from accidents. They blackened from habit, controlled combustion, a cycle of fire and sleep, fire and waking, fire and memory. Thermal comfort is not a luxury in a glacial world. It is the baseline of existence. The human body loses heat quickly in freezing air. Fingers stiffen, breathing slows, thoughts are dull. Without warmth, there is no planning, no teaching, no stories. Fire gives space for all three, and so the hearth becomes more than warmth. It is time. It allows people to pause, to think, to wait through a storm without moving, to sit with others and make plans, or sit in silence and simply exist. In a world where the cold demanded motion, fire permitted stillness. The mammoth bones gave the walls, but the fire gave the interior meaning. It was not only where people lived, it was how they lived. Together, quietly, through the deepest cold, and because fire was so central, its management was a form of art, an invisible architecture, less about what was built and more about what was sustained. Heat needed to remain, but danger could not accumulate. Smoke had to leave, but warmth had to stay. Every shelter was a lesson in containment, in the transfer of energy, in the delicate line between breath and burn. They likely used stones for storage of heat, collected from riverbeds or glacier edges, heated during the fire's peak, then moved into bedding zones or stacked near sleeping bodies. The stones slowly released their warmth through the night, an early form of thermal mass. No manuals, no diagrams, just instinct, passed by example. Do this, not that. Place it here, not there. There is evidence, too, in the pattern of burn marks. Scattered blackening near hearths, cracked pebbles beside tools, bones that show signs of repeated heating and cooling. These are the fingerprints of domestic fire. Not wild, not ceremonial, daily. And perhaps there were moments when the fire became more than a tool, when it became a presence. After the sun vanished behind clouds for weeks, after the wind scoured the horizon into nothing, the fire remained, a glow in the dark, a sound in the silence. Thermal comfort is not about temperature alone. It is about predictability, knowing that after hunting, there would be warmth, after work, rest, after fear, calm. Fire was the mechanism of that knowledge. It gave rhythm to the day, a center to the shelter, a symbol of continuity. Without it, the space collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. The ring of bones without fire is a tomb. With fire it is a hearth. With fire it is life. Excavations show more than just fire remains. They show the choreography around it. Tool-making concentrated near heat. Food processing is arranged around coals. Sleeping areas pushed just far enough to stay warm, not burn. Everything placed in relation to the flame, as if fire was not at the center of the room, but at the center of thought. This suggests planning. It suggests awareness of how heat moves, of how to optimize space without written measurement, just observation and memory. We do not know what they called this knowledge, or if they named it at all, but we know it worked, because it left behind the traces of people who did not freeze, who built it again and stayed again, who made shelter not just physical, but thermal, not just walls, but warmth. The inside of the shelter was not only protection from cold, it was a managed climate, a system of balance between combustion and breath. And in that balance, life continued. To understand how rare this was, we must return to the scale of the cold. During the peak of the Last Glacial Maximum, Average temperatures across the mammoth steppe may have dropped below -20 degrees Celsius for days at a time. The wind chill made it worse. Nights stretched long. Storms swept in without warning. Frost could build on the inside of a tent if a fire went out. Breathing itself could hurt. So this was not a mild discomfort. This was a test of every structure, every material, every decision. To stay warm was to win against physics. And these shelters won. Not with excess, but with precision. The hides mattered. Their thickness, their placement. Multiple layers may have been used. Hair side out to shed snow, flesh side in to retain heat. Stitching was likely done with sinew. Tight enough to block wind, flexible enough to move slightly without tearing. And over all this, snow may have been packed to insulate further. A seal of ice and silence. And inside, the fire, contained within its ring, its light bouncing off the tusk and skull. Above it, perhaps a small gap in the roof, a breathing hole, letting smoke rise, letting oxygen enter. But not enough to let the heat slip away. This is not easy architecture. It is adaptive, responsive. It demands attention. A fire could not be left alone. Someone had to tend it, feed it, adjust it. The warmth was not automatic. It was made. Hour by hour, night by night, and yet, for all its fragility, it worked. Because it was based on listening, to the wind, to the creak of hide in the night, to the shift of smoke in a low space. People turned themselves into the shelter. They knew its mood. They sensed its changes. They became part of its system. This intimacy between human and structure is not often discussed. But here, it is central. The shelters were not passive. They were living instruments, responding to flame, to body heat, to weather. When a seal failed, it was felt immediately. When a stone cooled too quickly, it was replaced. There was no buffer, no thermostat, only experience. That experience becomes visible in the soot marks, the burned scars, the distribution of ash. Each trace left in the archaeological record tells us the fire was not random. It was used with care, with repetition, with memory. And when one shelter worked, the knowledge passed on to another, to the next, to a new generation. In this way, thermal comfort became a tradition, a wisdom carried not in books, but in muscle, in breath. On the way, hands moved through the firelight, and what we call survival, they may have simply called life, not heroic, just necessary, and shared. Inside these shelters, thermal comfort was not a convenience. It was the foundation for every other act of living. It allowed children to sleep. It allowed elders to rest. It gave space for food to be processed, for tools to be shaped, for stories to be told. Without it, there would have been only motion, endless walking, endless cold. But with it, stillness became possible. Stillness was not idle. It was regenerative. A moment to heal cracked skin, to adjust clothing, to patch a torn boot, to plan the next movement across the snow. Without warmth, none of this could happen. Hands would lose their dexterity. Thoughts would slow. Cold does not merely kill the body. It unravels the ability to act, to decide, to prepare. So a fire inside the bones was not just a way to make heat. It was a way to keep thinking, to keep remembering, to carry the mind forward through a frozen world. Archaeological layers show that some of these hearths were reused. Ash on ash, fire built atop fire. This suggests permanence, at least for a season, perhaps even longer. A place returned to. A shelter was repaired. A circle of mammoth bone that became familiar. Its walls are dark with use. Its interior is soft with sleeping skins and old warmth. And if we imagine the fire in its final moment, a low red glow, a last ember buried under ash, a rising plume of smoke fading into the wind, we also imagine what was left behind. Warm stones, blackened ribs, a scent held in hide, a memory stored on earth. Today, we uncover that memory one layer at a time. A scatter of charcoal, a crack in stone, a crescent of soot traced across a fragment of ceiling hide. These are the signatures of presence, not loud, but durable, a kind of quiet engineering. Because to manage heat inside a shelter of bones is not only to beat the cold, it is to shape the atmosphere of life itself. a world where breath does not freeze, where movement remains possible, where the body can rest without bracing, where the child can sleep without shaking. These are small things, but in the Ice Age, they were everything, the difference between making it through the night or not. And so we honor these traces, not just for what they reveal about human skill, but for what they remind us about human attention. The fire was not only a tool, it was a companion, it was a rhythm, it was a center around which the structure lived. Fire inside the bones was not a metaphor, it was a method, it was a memory, it was a way to stay. And in staying, they did not just survive the Ice Age, they made it inhabitable. But what does a home look like when every breath of wind could carry frostbite? What signs are left behind when survival becomes ordinary and the extraordinary becomes routine? In the layers of soil pressed down by centuries of cold and thaw, we begin to see something almost tender. Not just tools and bones, but the outlines of lives lived close together. Day after day, night after night, in places like Mezherik and Kostenki, archaeologists found more than structure. They found presence. A scatter of flint flakes too small to be anything but the result of tool-making. A broken blade that may have belonged to someone's daily rhythm, and in some cases, marks in the packed earth. Little ovals no longer than a handspan, the faded remains of footprints, too small for adults. They suggest movement around the fire. Children near the hearth, not because they were studying the art of flint knapping, but because they were living there, existing in the warmest pocket of space available, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. These impressions, faint as they are, point to a powerful reality. These were not campsites for hunters, these were homes, temporarily or seasonally, but inhabited nonetheless. How do we know they were inhabited and not merely used for rest or refuge? Because the evidence is layered, it is dense. Bones are broken in ways that suggest marrow extraction, a sign of consumption over time, not a single feast. Ashes are layered from repeated fires. Tools are found at different stages of wear. And then, there is the garbage. In the margins of these bone-walled shelters, archaeologists often find what we might call trash zones. Pits or scatterings filled with splinters, ash, discarded bones, and worn-out implements. These are not the signs of a brief stay. They are echoes of people settling into a rhythm, working, eating, discarding. And around the hearth itself, the pattern of artifacts tells its own quiet story. Some tools appear to have been sharpened there, others were discarded. Bones show butchering marks. In one case, a reindeer antler with delicate carvings was found not far from such a hearth. Was it a toy? A ritual object? Something passed between hands as stories were told. These clues pull us deeper into the human scale of prehistory. They force us to imagine not only how these shelters stood, but how they breathed. How they filled with sound and scent and warmth. How the air inside them thickened with steam from boiling fat, with the breath of sleeping bodies, with the quiet shifting of people moving around each other in a space that had no corners, only curves of bone and hide. There is no way to know who exactly walked in those small footprints, but they speak louder than most fossils. They tell us that this was a place where life continued, not just in struggle, but in pattern, in presence, in the ordinary rituals of staying. In these spaces, domestic life was not separated from survival. They were one and the same. A sharpened blade was both a tool and a teaching. A piece of hide could be a garment, a blanket, a cradle. The fire was warmth, but also light, and also a place for watching, for speaking, for listening. There is something deeply human about these circular interiors. Every member of a group could see every other member. No hallways, no private rooms, just one shared breath. This meant that the young saw the old work. The old watched the young learn. Communication was constant, not always spoken, but always felt. In this way, knowledge moved not only across time but across space. A child did not have to be taught how to flake stone in a formal sense. They only had to watch, night after night, by firelight. From the warmest part of the shelter, their hands would learn by mimicry, by rhythm, by proximity. This proximity was not optional. The Ice Age did not allow for distance. It demanded closeness, a necessity that became culture, a constraint that became a connection. Excavations show that many of the tools found near hearths were reworked items, older blades repurposed, scrapers sharpened again and again. This indicates an environment of careful conservation. Nothing was wasted, but it also suggests the presence of hands ready to fix, ready to adjust. Someone watching the tool wear down and knowing exactly when it had one more use left. That kind of attention comes from being nearby, from being embedded in the cycles of daily life, not just for the hunters, but for everyone. And when we imagine the space inside these shelters, it becomes clear that generational life was not divided. Infants slept beside the old. Adults passed meat to the young. Elders watched flames while others slept. Age did not separate people into roles, it braided them into one experience. What emerges is a picture of cohesion, not idealized, not without tension, but united by circumstance, bound together by necessity, and elevated by the knowledge that what was shared, warmth, light, food, space, was what made life possible. The small objects left behind confirm this. A flint core too small to be functional might have belonged to a learner. A pierced shell might have been worn around the neck. A bone bead carved with care might have passed from hand to hand. These were not decorative alone. They were markers of identity, of belonging, of being seen. In this dense and circular world, to be seen was everything. To be remembered was survival. That remembrance did not require grand gestures. It required attention, a gesture of handing someone a warmed stone, the soft murmur of a name in the dark, the way meat was shared from the center of the hearth outward. These moments became memories. They became the architecture of belonging. The circular shelter shaped more than just temperature. It shaped our relationship. When a group lives within a round boundary, the spatial logic becomes social. There is no front, no back, no upstairs, no privacy. Everyone is equally present, equally exposed. Every act becomes visible. Every sound is shared. The circle becomes a language of cohesion. This is what archaeologists call social geometry, not the abstract mathematics of shape, but the lived experience of bodies in space, where someone sits, says something. Who sits close to the fire, and who sits at the edge? Who sleeps beside whom? Who prepares the tools? Who tends the flame? Even today, in small-scale societies, this geometry carries meaning. In the Ice Age, it would have been heightened by the limits of space and time. During the coldest months, groups may have remained indoors for weeks. The only world they knew was this circle of hide and bone. So what happened inside mattered more than ever. Traces of this pattern remain in the distribution of artifacts. Blade cores tend to cluster in one area, food bones in another, ash in the middle, sleeping zones toward the walls. These are not random. They are the imprint of routine. They tell us that daily life was choreographed, not rigid, but habitual, a way of being in space that minimized conflict, that allowed work to happen without constant negotiation. That gave children a place to play, gave the elders a place to sit, gave fire the space it needed to breathe. And in these patterns, we see the ghost of intention. Someone taught others where to sit. Someone learned not to step too close to the coals. Someone kept the tools near their sleeping spot. These decisions formed a shared logic, a rhythm passed from body to body. Not written, but I remembered. In this memory, time thickens. The past is never far. A child hears a story beside the same fire, where their mother once Saturday. A bone tool is used by more than one hand. The walls absorb breath from generation to generation, and the structure becomes more than shelter. It becomes an archive. Not an archive of dates, but of gestures, of roles, of relationships. On the way, a group came together and stayed together, through storms, through hunger, through seasons of dark. The hearth, at the center of this geometry, becomes something more than functional. It becomes symbolic, a place where all paths converge, where time folds inward, where the circle becomes both structure and story. And in that story, the smallest traces speak the loudest. A child's footprint near the hearth is not just a mark in the soil. It is an echo of warmth. It tells us where the child stood, how close they were allowed, how much trust lived in that small space between flame and skin. It speaks of proximity, of care, of presence. When archaeologists find such traces, they pause, not because of their scientific weight alone, but because of their emotional clarity. The fire burned. The child watched. The world outside howled with wind. Inside, someone reached for a tool. Someone chewed dried meat. Someone rubbed frost from a cracked hand. It is easy to reduce prehistory to a list of objects. Blades, bones, scrapers. But these were not objects in isolation. They were held, used, passed. And when they broke, they were discarded. Where someone, Saturday, this proximity, leaves a pattern, a kind of map. In one excavated shelter, a dense patch of flakes lay just to the left of a hearth. Flint chips, too small to be of further use. Likely the result of repeated tool sharpening, this suggests a favoured spot. Perhaps a maker always sat there. Perhaps it was their place. Not claimed with speech, but with habit. With muscle memory, nearby, food bones show repeated burning, indicating not just cooking, but recooking. Reuse. Heat used to soften joints. To render fat, the smell must have soaked into everything. Hide, hair, skin. It was not a clean place, but it was known. Familiar. This familiarity breeds adaptation. Within such a confined space, people adjusted. They learned to move without collision. They learned to whisper when others slept, to sit in silence when the storm pressed close, to share what little there was, again and again. And it is in these small acts that we glimpse the full depth of humanity, not in the dramatic hunt, but in the shared sip. The past tool. They laugh in the dark, the hush before sleep. What is remarkable is not only that these people endured, but they did so with others. Side by side, through winters long enough to forget the Sunday inn, shelters made of bone, lit by flame, marked by footsteps that now lie buried. Excavation is an act of recognition. To find a child's footprint is not to discover a fact. It is to acknowledge a life, a presence, a night spent near a fire, a world made livable not by technology, but by intimacy. And through these traces, we begin to understand that the Ice Age was not only an era of scarcity, it was a stage for connection, and the footprints near the hearth are its most delicate evidence. These were not prints of conquest. They were not left behind in the wake of expansion or glory. They were made in pauses, in moments between necessity, left by feet small enough to wobble, feet that had not yet learned the weight of winter. And still, they stood near the fire, close to the hands that built it, wrapped in the air, warmed by the labour of others. That nearness is what survives. Not the sound of voices, not the stories told, but the closeness of bodies in a shared space. The arrangement of lives inside a shelter no wider than a modern room, a world compressed, a family folded in on itself. Not hidden, but held. Archaeology gives us the outlines: hearth, bone wall, tool scatter, but imagination gives it breath. We see the adult turning a blade, the elder mending hides, the child chewed something tough. We see them all lit by the same fire. Shadows moving together, not in silence, but in softness. Social life in the Ice Age was not written. It was spatial. It was rhythmic. It was shaped by cold and hunger and wind, but also by gestures, by the geometry of bodies arranged in mutual awareness. No privacy, no secrets, just the rhythm of togetherness repeated again and again. That rhythm left patterns: flint by the sleeping hides, ash between the foot bones, charred marrow splinters near the edge. They speak of sequence, of people doing the same things in the same places for days or weeks. A kind of stability inside instability. And at the centre of it all, the fire, the quiet engine of life, flickering, smoking, cracking, burning low, fed again, watched again, surrounded by people who had learned to listen to its moods, who knew when it needed more fuel, when it needed wind, when it needed rest. They were not just surviving the Ice Age. They were living inside of it, not apart from the cold, but inside it, warmed by one another, defined by the space they made together. A circle, a hearth, a set of footprints pressed into packed earth that would not see sunlight for 20,000 years. And when we find these footprints, we find more than shape. We find motion. We find pause. We find the ghost of someone who stood still just long enough, who waited for meat to boil, who turned their head to the sound of flint, who watched the flame shift its colour. That moment is gone. but it left a mark, a shallow depression on earth, a quiet statement. I was here. I lived. I was part of this warmth, and now we, thousands of years later, step carefully around that mark. We study it. We document it. We name its dimensions. But more than that, we listen, because in that footprint is not just a child. There is a family. There is a fire. There is a home. But what happens to a home when the walls begin to breathe? Somewhere in the heart of the Ice Age steppe, the first walls did not rise from timber or stone. They bent and folded. They rustled in the wind. They swelled and slumped like lungs. These were walls made from skin, not human skin, but the hide of the mammoth. Thick, pliable, heavy with grease. It was not architecture in the way we usually imagine it. It was closer to clothing. A shelter not built, but worn by the earth. And like clothing, it did more than shield. It shaped the air within. Archaeologists have uncovered the outlines of these skin-lined homes in places like Mezhyrich and Kostenki. But the walls are long gone. What remains are their shadows. Rings of bones where tusks anchored the frames. Circular depressions where hides once stretched between ribs. Scattered soot. Thin black streaks in sediment. Traces of heat and smoke. All of it forming a picture not just of structure, but of atmosphere. What do these traces really tell us? They speak of darkness. Not total darkness, but a soft, persistent dimness. The kind of filtered light that makes everything seem close. The hides blocked the Sunday. The smoke blurred the air. And in this filtered space, time itself must have slowed. There are places on Earth today where similar structures are still used. The Chukchi Yaranga, the Sami Lavu, the Inuit Tupik. Though separated by vast time, they echo with common design. Low entrances to keep the warmth in. Central fires to push smoke upward. Thick hides layered for insulation. What unites them is a mastery of enclosure, not just in material, but in mindset. Because once you enclose space, you enclose attention. You shape how sound travels, how heat lingers, how people speak, how people think. In the glacial shelters of Upper Paleolithic Eurasia, it is likely that many layers of mammoth hide lined the interior. These were not purely functional. They transformed the sensory environment. They deadened the sound. They muted the wind. They allowed heat to rise, hover, and return. The effect was not unlike entering a cave. Except this cave was made of giants, and there is one more clue. The blackening of the bone. Not just around the hearth, but high up on the tusks, near the top of the frames, suggesting that smoke filled the upper cavity of the shelter, not always escaping, often trapped, turning the inside of the home into a slow swirl of warmth and haze. This is where humans lived, not in bright open halls, but in muted cocoons, wrapped in smoke and skin, shielded from the cold, not just by material, but by mood. So the next question becomes almost inevitable. What did they do in the dark? The dark was not silent. The fire hissed. The wind pressed against the hide walls. Sparks rose. Shadows danced. And within that enclosure, people spoke. Not loudly. Voices in tight spaces tend to soften. But the darkness created by thick mammoth hides and the smoke trapped beneath the ceiling made more than warmth. It gave me privacy. Not the kind we know today, but something more intimate. A separation from the vastness outside. When the steppe howled and the sky fell white with snow, this darkness became shelter in every sense. A world within a world. And like all enclosed spaces, it shaped time. Inside a shelter like this, there are no clocks, no sunlight marking the hours, only the rhythm of the fire, the rhythm of breath, the murmur of stories shared to pass the hours, the rasp of a stone against bone, the slow cooking of marrow and fat. The hides did not only insulate, they veiled. They turned the world inward. What mattered was no longer the horizon. It was the glow of the hearth, the outline of a mother's shoulder, the soft sound of a child asleep beneath furs. This inward turn is not just emotional. It has archaeological traces. Sites reveal compact living zones, tool clusters in patterns, repeated actions in repeated places, each act echoing the last, memory folded into space. The walls shaped behavior. They encouraged people to stay close, to share tasks, to hand objects from one side of the hearth to the other, to lean in, to wait, to listen. And then there is the question of light. Firelight behaves differently when contained. It reflects. It flickers across the hide. It casts shadows onto bone. The ceiling would shimmer with motion. The walls would breathe with orange and red. This was not bright. It was a suggestion. Faces half lit, hands illuminated just long enough to work, then fading again into dusk. And the smoke, every breath taken inside such a shelter, was shared with the residue of burning things. Wood was rare. So were dry grasses. Often the fuel was bone, mammoth ribs, marrowed femurs. These burned hot, but they burned densely. The smoke lingered. It curled through the structure. It painted the hides with soot. It dried the air. It coated hair and skin. There is evidence of this in the lungs of Ice Age mummies. Traces of long exposure to particulate matter. A life lived in smoke, in low light, in warmth shaped by combustion and enclosure. But this was not discomfort. This was the price of survival. And more than that, it was the condition for thought, because darkness does something. It focuses. It quiets. It allows speech to deepen. It allows the story to grow long. And in this ancient darkness, it is possible that memory was not just stored, it was formed, spoken, heard. The shelter was not only for the body, it was for the mind. In these enclosures, darkness was not the absence of light. It was a presence, a weight, a boundary drawn around thought. The shelter became a chamber not just for warmth, but for imagination, and perhaps for memory itself. When the cold outside lasted for months, what else could humans do but remember and speak and wonder? The smoke carried voices upward, words softened by skin and soot. Every story told was absorbed by the walls, and perhaps, in some way, by the children listening near the fire. The darkness held them, not just physically, but mentally. It made space for slow language, for rhythm, for silence. This is not speculation alone. In the patterns of excavation, there are suggestions of interior zoning. Objects grouped in deliberate ways, small piles of ochre, charcoal mixed with crushed bone, beads arranged in clusters. These are not merely artifacts, they are the fingerprints of thought. The hide walls limited the horizon, but within that limit, complexity grew. Without distraction, attention turned inward. Inside this smoky space, meaning was not found, it was made. There is something else. The way hides control not only light, but temperature. They breathe. They trap heat during the night and release it slowly. Multiple layers may have been adjusted based on wind direction. Snow pressed against the outside added insulation. The shelter became dynamic, a system of responses, and humans responded in kind. Their movement patterns suggest rhythm, not hurried, measured. Fire fed at intervals, food prepared in repetition. The interior life is shaped by predictable loops. There is a calmness in that, a kind of trust in repetition. One can imagine an elder leaning against a tusk, eyes half closed, speaking slowly to the child across the hearth. The child sharpened a flake, the adult listening, not because they had to, but because the enclosure made listening easier. The darkness made attention possible. It is easy to think of Ice Age people as busy, always working to survive, but these shelters suggest another truth. That survival sometimes included stillness. Within the walls of bone and hide, there was space for pause, and this pause became a kind of technology, not made of tools, but of behavior, a social innovation. Time carved not by the sun, but by the hearth. Lives shaped not by motion, but by containment. The evidence continues in the ceilings. On some bones recovered from shelter sites, there are deposits of soot that could only have formed from long exposure to rising smoke. This indicates regular burning, controlled combustion, a sustained habit of creating warmth and light within an enclosed world. What kind of conversations took place beneath those ceilings? What decisions? What moments of laughter? What tears? The hide walls did not hear, but they held. They softened the edges of cold and silence, and in doing so, they made human time possible. Archaeology rarely captures the tempo of life. It reveals moments frozen by sediment, bones, tools, ash. But what happens between those moments is usually gone. Except here, inside the circle of bones and hide, there are clues to rhythm. Not just what people did, but how often, and how gently. Scattered tools tell one story. They cluster near hearths, near the center, not far from each other. That proximity suggests shared activity, work done in parallel, not isolation. Stone flakes mixed with bone shavings, needles near fire-cracked rock. It paints a picture of closeness, not just spatial, but emotional. Within these low domes of hide and smoke, people moved slowly, not because they were weak, but because the space asked them to. The ceiling was low, the air was thick, movements had to be deliberate, there was no room for haste. This changed how tasks unfolded. It encouraged collaboration. A child could hand a tool to a parent. An elder could watch a technique passed down. These were places of learning, not with formal lessons, but with eyes, with hands, with repetition. The hides helped shape that too. They were more than barriers. They were surfaces. A child might draw on them with ochre. A toolmaker might hang blades from their folds. A storyteller might gesture toward their curve as the story's horizon. We do not have these hides now. Only the anchor bones remain. But the absence of the hides is also a presence. It is the negative space of warmth, the ghost of enclosure, and in that ghost we find a kind of logic, a design adapted to scarcity. No trees, no bricks, no canvas, just what was available: bone, hide, fire, and time. This is engineering under constraint. Architecture born of necessity, but also intimacy. Because the solution was not grand, it was close. It was shaped for the body, for the voice, for the fire, and it changed how humans used time. The longer the cold outside lasted, the more important it became to have places that slowed everything down, not paused, just slowed. Enough to let words form, enough to let children grow, enough to let people breathe together. Hide and smoke and darkness gave permission, not to stop working, but to do it differently, with awareness, with sequence, with softness. The interiors of these shelters were not chaotic. They were patterned. Even the ash tells this. It settles in concentric rings, traces of how fire was tended, where people sat a day, where warmth reached, where it did not. And in those patterns, we glimpse routine. Days shaped not by sunlight, but by the warmth radius of a small hearth. This was not accidental. This survival was made elegant, made human, because what we see here is not just endurance. It is adapted through the atmosphere. These shelters were not only physical forms, they were emotional containers, holding more than people, holding ways of being. The evidence tells us something simple, that even when the world was ice and silence, humans made spaces where life could continue, not just breathing, but being. Thoughtful, rhythmic, attuned. Each layer of hide stretched across bone was a gesture of care. Each smouldering heart has a decision. Each low ceiling is a choice to stay together. Close, warm, alive. We can imagine the smoke rising in spirals. We can imagine the quiet movements in that filtered light. A hand turning meat on a flat stone, a child rolling a bead across a fur, a voice repeating an old story, not for the first time, not for the last. The darkness was not a void. It was a cradle, and in that cradle, humans practiced presence. They listened, they remembered, they planned, they dreamed. The archaeological layers hold hints of this. Charred bone crushed into pigment, suggesting decoration. Ash mixed with ochre, perhaps for skin, perhaps for hide, perhaps for ritual. These are not acts of survival. They are acts of meaning. And meaning thrives in enclosed spaces. Because to enclose something is to give it shape, to protect it, to say that what happens inside matters. This is what the smoke-darkened shelters of the Ice Age teach us. That when the world outside is hostile and vast, the answer is not always to fight it. Sometimes it is to soften space, to control light, to gather warmth, to listen. The hides did more than trap heat. They shaped feelings. They made a world within a world. And that interior world gave rise to something rare. Stillness. Not stagnation, but stillness as a foundation. A place to feel safe enough to be slow, to be quiet, to be human in full. It is likely that within these spaces, many of the first myths were spoken, many of the first songs hummed, many of the first moments of real reflection allowed. The structure made it possible. And in this, we see something profound. That the limits of the environment did not diminish these people. They refined them. They asked for ingenuity. And what humans gave in return was elegance. The smoke curled, the hides shifted, the fire breathed, and within all of it, people endured, not as figures hunched in the dark, but as minds formed from shadow, forming meaning from ash. So much has changed. The shelters are gone, the hides dissolved, the bones were excavated, but the darkness remains, not as an absence, but as a memory. And if you close your eyes and imagine that heavy silence, that filtered firelight, you may hear it too, the voice of the past speaking not in words, but in warmth, in rhythm, in the soft breath of a life, once lived indoors, and then, as the snow softened, something changed. One morning the hearth burned longer than usual. The hides were rolled, tools wrapped in fur, embers left glowing in the ash. The ring of bones stood quiet, a curved silhouette against the wind. And then there was fire. Not to cook, not too warm, but to end. Flames licked the edges of the mammoth ribs. Smoke curled upward into a still sky, not rushed, not wild, but deliberate, like the closing of a lid, like the silence that follows a final word. No one ran, no one watched in fear. They had done this before. The oldest ones knew the rhythm. The ring had served its time. It had given warmth, held stories, keep sleep from freezing. But now, its season is finished. Some families stayed longer than others. Some moved with the herds. Others waited for the ground to thaw. But when the shelters had done their part, they were not left to rot. They were released. The bones darkened. The floor cracked. Ash mixed with broken tools and burnt bits of hide. A memory sealed in soot. It was not sadness. It was closed. To burn a shelter was to say thank you, to mark that it had held something sacred. A winter survived. A hunger endured. A child has grown. A death mourned. Each ring told its own version. Some were burned fully, others only partially, some not at all. But those who did light the fires knew what it meant. It meant this place was no longer alive. A shelter could hold only so many nights before it began to forget what it was. Fire gave it shape again. The next snows would fall over the blackened bones. Winds would spread the ash into the grass. Birds would pick through the scraps. The circle would return to the earth in time. But for now, it stood. A dark halo on the steppe. A memory made of smoke. The ones who had built it walked on. They followed the low trails of mammoth prints. They moved toward rivers that had not yet thawed. They left behind warmth and waited to build it again. The world was too wide to stay in one place, and the bones of giants were not meant to last forever. But even as they walked, the smell of soot clung to their furs. A part of the home they carried with them. The ring still flickered in their minds. A shelter gone, a fire given. The season has closed. But memory is not only something that lives in the mind. It also settles in the hands, in the weight of the pack, in the smell of a scorched hide, in the soft soot that blackens fingertips days after the fire is gone. When they walked away, they carried more than tools. They carried the rhythm of the place, the patterns of sleep, the way someone had always sat near the north wall, the rhythm of firewood stacked in spirals, the sound of wind through mammoth ribs at night. These were not things left behind. They travelled inside the body, and still, the abandoned shelter stood for a while, blackened bones leaning inward, hearthstones cracked from heat, burnt ash curling through the debris. No walls, no smoke, but the shape of life is still visible. Crows came first, then foxes, a quiet reclaiming. But the ring itself was a message, not for others, not even for those who had built it, but for the land, a sign that this place had been used, and that its story was over. For some families, the return might come next year. They would find the ring again, step through it carefully. Some would smile. Some would look down at the ash. Others would keep walking, remembering only the warmth. But not every ring was reused. There were places too cold, places too sad, places that had held loss. Some rings were left untouched for years. Others, forever. It was not a rule. It was a feeling. In some seasons, the shelter might never be burned. The bones would collapse slowly, buried under snow. Grass would grow through the ribs in spring, and after many years, the circle would vanish. But when the fire was chosen, it was an act of marking. The difference between something forgotten and something remembered. A final gesture that said, We lived here. For a time, this was the center of the world. The tools left behind were not wasted. They were tokens, small things too old or too broken to carry again, but still full of meaning. A chipped flint, a curved antler with a groove carved deep. A child's bead was lost in the ash. These small remains shimmered like embers, faint and persistent. In the next camp, new tools would be shaped, fresh hides stretched, bones sorted and arranged. A new ring would rise, but some part of the last one would still be there. In the design of the hearth, on the way, people sat near the fire. In the stories, whispered through smoke, because the memory of a home is not just in its structure, it is in the rituals carried forward. And even as the next ring began to form, its center still cold and bare, something from the burnt bones traveled with them. Not ashes, not soot, but the rhythm of return. Not all movement was wandering. Some had direction, shaped by rivers, by herds, by remembered places. People did not roam blindly. They followed invisible maps traced across the land by memory, hunger, and the turn of seasons. Some rings were never meant to last. Others were waiting to be found again. There were winters when the same shelter was rebuilt in the same spot, just beside the bones of the old one. The curved ribs of mammoths, weathered and half collapsed, stood beside newer ones, pale and unburned. Two rings, one of the past, one of the present. Between them, ash mixed with new snow, time folded into space. Children played in the older ring. Adults slept in the new one. Stories passed across the gap like smoke across wind. Some families believed these places held something more than shelter, a memory in the land itself, a feeling of safety that was not only physical. Some places felt more silent than others. Some felt warmer, even before the fire was lit. Maybe it was the way the wind moved, or the curve of the slope, or the sound of mammoth bones creaking in the dark. Or maybe it was the memory of all who had come before. Even when not spoken aloud, it lingered. In these spaces, people did not speak of ownership, but of use, of return, of presence. A place could be used again and again, without being taken. A ring of bone was never a fortress. It was a center, and centers can shift. Some years the herds did not pass nearby. The rivers froze too early. The sky stayed grey for weeks. Then the families moved elsewhere, built new rings, found new rhythms. But the old rings were not erased. They lay quiet beneath snow and moss, waiting. Sometimes when people passed near an old camp, they stopped, not to stay, but to remember, to place a hand on a bone, to look at the char, to feel the outline of a life once held by that place. And in that pause, there was a kind of reverence, not for architecture, but for survival, for warmth, for the fact that someone once stayed here and lived. The ring might be crumbling, the hearthstone cracked, but the circle remained, a shape the wind remembered. Over time, the difference between shelter and memory grew thin. A ring was not just a wall. It was a song, a rhythm of stone and bone and ash. And when a new ring was made, even in a new place, its center aligned with something old. A warmth remembered, a silence preserved, because even in departure, there was continuity. The trail moved forward. The bones stayed behind, but the shape of living continued. As seasons circled, so did the patterns of return. The land was not empty between shelters. It was filled with echoes. Not loud, not clear, but present. A faint rhythm pressed into soil. A memory etched in the pause between migrations. Not all rings were equal. Some became known across generations. Places where the snow fell softer, where the fire caught faster, where the bones settled easily into the curve of the ground. To return to such a place was not always planned. Sometimes the feet just found it. The hands remembered where to dig. The eyes saw what others had once seen. A certain bend in the river, a hollow that cradled the wind, and yet even those places did not last forever. Some were left not because they failed, but because something else was called louder. Herds shifted. Ice cracked. A birth. A death. A feeling in the gut that said it was time to move. Sometimes they left in calm, sometimes in haste. There were rings where the fire burned not gently, but fast, where bones were scorched unevenly, where hides were left unrolled, where tools lay scattered in corners. These places spoke not of seasons ending, but of something breaking. Still, even here, there was no panic written on the earth. only quiet. Ash blown into corners, burnt splinters of ribs. The circle is distorted but still complete. Even in flight, people did not destroy what they had built. They left signs. A pile of stones. A cracked pot turned upside down. A single footprint pressed deep into mud. These were signals, no warnings. But memories were made visible. There were no calendars here, no scripts, no maps. But there was an understanding, a rhythm, a trust that the land remembered. And so did the people. When they walked through fog or over frozen rivers, they carried not only their tools and their children, but the layout of the last ring, the scent of the last fire, the way shadows fell against hide walls, the silence before sleep. These things did not weigh much, but they shaped everything. They shaped how the next ring would form, how the bones would lean, where the fire would sit, who would sleep closest to the warmth. The past was not behind them, it was beside them. It breathed through each decision, even the smallest gestures, the way a rib was angled, the order of stones around the hearth, the spacing between sleeping skins held echoes. So when a ring was left behind, blackened or intact, it did not vanish. It folded into memory. And memory is its own kind of architecture. It builds without timber. It shelters without walls. It carries warmth across distances the body alone could not endure. In the emptiness between shelters, memory became the roof. Even long after a ring had vanished beneath layers of snow and soil, its presence remained. Some rings were known only by the way the grass bent, others by how silence deepened when one passed near. They did not speak of it aloud. But the body noticed. The hands would lower without thinking. The eyes would scan for traces. Even if nothing was visible, the memory shaped the way they walked. That was the power of these places. Not permanence, but imprint. Some fires leave no scar on the ground, but they burn in the mind, in the choices passed on through touch and glance. In this way, stories begin with a place rather than a time. A child who grew inside a ring of mammoth bones would one day carry that shape into the ring they built for others, not as an instruction, but as a rhythm, felt rather than taught. So, abandonment was never full, even when a ring was burned, even when it was buried. Its shape reappeared in the next one. Altered, shifted, but familiar. There were rings that stretched wider, others that leaned closer. Some had twin hearths, some only one, but the center was always there, a space made not just for warmth, but for presence, because these rings were not only shelters from cold, they were the containers of life. They held sleep and laughter and silence. They waited, they held memories, and when they were left behind, the act was not one of forgetting. It was part of the rhythm. In the great breath of the Ice Age, each ring was a heartbeat. Temporary, necessary, felt more than seen. Families moved, seasons turned, fires were lit and extinguished. But the pattern endured. A ring, a fire, a departure, a return. In this quiet exchange with the land, the people shaped and were shaped. No monuments, no names carved in stone, only the soft trace of ash, only bones darkened by smoke, and the long arc of memory winding like a trail across the mammoth steppe. There would be more shelters, more departures, more circles burned into frostbitten earth. But always, the story continued, because even in silence, even in ash, even in rings abandoned to wind and time, something remained. A presence, a shape, a warmth once made by hands, and in that warmth, the memory of endurance. The fire still glowed softly in the dark, though the air outside had shifted. The cold was no longer sharp. It had become grainy and wet. Melt crept into the outermost walls of hide. The packed snow lost its edge. Something had changed, and across the distant steppe, the sound of the wind no longer moved in a single direction. It danced. The seasons, always subtle at first, had begun their turn. We must imagine a small group gathering at the edge of their world, staring out toward a landscape that no longer answers their needs. The snow beneath them was pocked with fresh melt. Their bones ached. The air had a strange humidity to it. And behind them sat a ring of bones and hides, painstakingly built across long weeks of hunger and invention. A place they had shaped with their own breath. Now, they were leaving it behind. But why would they walk away from something they had fought so hard to create? The deeper question, of course, is how long anyone could ever stay, and what force exactly, was large enough to pull a family away from the only walls that had ever truly shielded them? The unsettling answer is this. It was not war. It did not collapse. It was a movement. The kind written not in politics or panic, but in the bodies of animals and the soft revolutions of the earth. Mammoths moved. So humans moved. A shelter, no matter how clever, could not keep the landscape still. To understand this rhythm, we must first return to the pulse of the steppe itself. This was not an empty plain. It was alive with movements so vast and seasonal that the humans living here were merely a thread in its fabric. Mammoths were the largest players in this slow performance. But they were not alone. Woolly rhinos, reindeer, giant deer, all following food in subtle arcs across thousands of miles. Their bodies knew the wind. Their feet remembered old paths, and they moved not in chaos, but in ancient memory. The humans watched them closely. Every step an animal took held a kind of meaning. Tracks in the slush, a broken tree stump rubbed with old scent, a distant cry echoing off hard ice. These were signals, hints, warnings. When the herds turned, the people turned too. It was not just about food. Though food was critical, it was also about survival in a larger sense. These animals shaped the entire structure of Ice Age life. They provided fat, bone, sinew, hide, and warmth. Where the herds lived, humans could live. Where they went, humans had to follow. And so the shelters, those magnificent rings of bone and hide, were never meant to be forever. They were precise responses to moments in time. They were bursts of stillness in an otherwise moving life. They were pauses, but every pause ended. And the first sign was always silence. No mammoth calls, no prints in the snow, no fresh dung steaming in the morning cold. The land stopped speaking. That was how you knew it was time. Even before a shelter failed, the land could tell you to go. In the bone rings left behind, we find no desperation, no frantic scrawls, no signs of collapse. Only the quiet order of a space carefully vacated. The fire allowed it to die down. The hearth was left clear of debris. A skin rolled and taken. A path trodden once, twice, then vanished. There is a kind of grace in departure. Not all moves were sudden. Some were prepared for over days, watching the sky, listening to the animals, testing the snow beneath the feet. A shift in the crunch, a shift in the smell, a heaviness to the clouds. Others were faster. A weather turn, a fracture in the ice, the warning silence of the mammoth herds. Then, quickly, decisions. Wrap the infant, bury the bones too heavy to carry, mark the place with something small, a shard, a twist of fibre, a burnt end of branch, something to remember. Because always, there was the possibility of returning, but return could not be assumed. Not when the world moved by its own rules. That is why mobility was not just a habit, it was a skill. A way of thinking, a kind of muscle memory passed across generations. These were not people caught in endless wandering. They were attuned. They moved not out of chaos, but in response. This is where the tension begins, because the shelters grew more complex. Rings of mammoth bones, multiple hearths, organized zones, trash piles, sleeping areas, cooking pits, child-sized footprints circling fire. These were not momentary camps. They were homes. Yet they were homes built with the knowledge that they must be left behind. That tension lived in every layer of packed earth inside those circles. A people making stillness with one hand, while holding readiness with the other. Not everyone moved easily. Elders, infants, the sick, the injured. But the pressure came all the same. Pressure not just from hunger, but from weather. The shift of wind patterns, the flooding of low ground, the subtle melt that turned shelter into risk. And from within the shelter itself, time applied pressure too. The fire darkened the hides. Smoke soaked into bones. Moisture found cracks. Tools dulled. Sleeping spaces lost their warmth. No matter how well built, the ring was not eternal. Outside, the land cooled. A patch of green in the distance. A bird unseen for weeks. A sound carried faintly in the night. Even the snow could speak. Its graininess, its tilt, its scent. And once the signs aligned, they could not be ignored. It was not a choice made lightly, but it was a choice made often. They knew what to carry, what to leave, what to dismantle, what to let the wind claim. And when they turned from the ring, they turned not just toward survival, but toward rhythm, because Ice Age life was not built on permanence. It was built on movement made visible, every trail carved through snow, every footprint that faded with the wind, every line of sight scanned for distant herds. These were not signs of loss. They were expressions of belonging to something larger than shelter. The people of the steppe belonged to the land, not because they owned it, but because they listened to it. And the land, in turn, shaped their every decision. This was not a place where walls lasted generations. It was a place where memory lasted longer than bone. A child born in one ring might grow up in another. The fire that warmed them might be built miles away from the one that came before it. But still, something familiar echoed through each pause in the journey. That echo was rhythm. The pressure to move did not always feel like a threat. Sometimes it felt like breath. Exhale, dismantle, walk, inhale, stop, build, and so it continued. But there were choices within this rhythm. Not all people moved at the same pace. Some groups experimented with staying longer. Others followed the herds more closely. The idea of remaining even briefly took on different meanings in different parts of the steppe. Near river corridors or thermal springs, the snow retreated sooner. Game lingered, water pooled, and here, families could stretch their stay. Shelters grew more elaborate, hearths multiplied, pits deepened, refuse accumulated. Still, the pressure never fully lifted, because the landscape itself never stopped changing. Glacial winds scoured the open plains, snowdrifts shifted, rivers froze and cracked and reformed. Even in places of temporary abundance, nature reminded its guests that their stay was borrowed. In this way, the tension between mobility and rest became a kind of education. A lesson written in mud and mammoth prints, in smoke trails, in sore knees and well-worn paths. The very shape of Ice Age knowledge was defined by this dual awareness. Build carefully, but be ready to leave. Stay close to fire, but know where the next fire will burn. Carry only what matters, and let go of what you cannot keep. That letting go was not always easy. When the ring had been warm, when the walls had held, when the children had laughed near the hearth, when songs had risen into darkness and smoke, leaving a place like that was an ache. But it was also the price of belonging. The steppe did not allow ownership. It offered only time, a season, a crossing, a patch of grass that briefly stirred with life. When that time ended, the shelter became a memory. And memory was carried in the body, in the hands that had once tied sinew to bone, in the shoulders that remembered the weight of hides, in the feet that knew the path forward even before it was seen. So movement was not just a necessity, it was an identity, and each step forward was a continuation of the pattern. The landscape itself held the traces of these movements. Not always visible, but sensed. A curve in the ridge where old footsteps had worn the earth soft. A clearing where nothing grew, where once a ring had stood. Scattered flakes of stone left behind like punctuation in a long, unwritten sentence. The people moved, but they left rhythms behind. Some returned to old places. Some did not. But in either case, the earth remembered. In this way, the idea of home expanded. It was not a fixed structure. It was a constellation of remembered places. It was warmth shared beneath bone and hide. It was a distant hill that once gave shelter from the wind. A bend in a frozen river where mammoths had been seen. A fire built where a fire had once burned. Home was the act of recognizing the familiar in the unfamiliar. But there were risks. The pressure to move meant gambling with uncertainty. One direction might bring herds, another might bring nothing. The weather could turn, the old paths might be blocked, and still the decision had to be made. They watched the sky, they felt the ground, they read the movements of animals, the way one reads a long, winding story, not for endings, but for clues. And with that knowledge, they acted. Sometimes the path ahead was brutal. Ice slick over soft melt, winds sharp enough to crack lips and split skin. Children bundled close, tools packed tight, spirits whispered low to keep fear away. And in those long walks between shelter and shelter, time stretched thin. Each moment carried weight, but they moved anyway, because stasis was not an option, and in motion there was purpose. It was a return to something deeper than planning. It was aligned with the patterns of the world. The herds moved, the wind shifted, the light changed, so the people followed. There was beauty in that following, not passive, not mindless, but relational. an understanding built on generations of observation and listening, knowing where the reindeer might turn when the snow softened, where the mammoth might pause when a ridge blocked the wind, knowing that ice sings before it breaks. All of this informed their steps, and when they paused again and built anew, it was not from scratch, it was from memory. Memory of what had worked before, memory of where warmth had gathered in the ring, memory of how to stretch hide so it did not sag, memory of where to dig the hearth so the smoke escaped cleanly. These were not wanderers, they were composers, writing with materials that changed, composing with movement and time, and every shelter, every ring, every fire was a note in that composition. Even as they left them behind, the memory of each place stayed folded into the muscles of those who had shaped it. In the way hands gripped bone, in the angle of the foot as it stepped across crusted snow. In this way, a child knew where to sit near the fire. Movement was never without continuity. It was a circle that opened, travelled, and returned, even if not to the same place. Sometimes, a new ring was built just beyond sight of the old. Sometimes it was far across the steppe, where the grass stirred with different winds. But always, it was built with knowledge, carried from elsewhere, tempered by experience, and coloured by hope that this next place might last, even if only for a season. This movement, repeated across years, generations, lives shaped more than their bodies. It shaped their minds, a kind of thoughtfulness born of impermanence, to build with care, knowing it would be taken down, to love a place fully and still be able to walk away from it. They did not call it loss, they called it time, and with time came a deeper pattern. Not just of movement across the earth, but of return, to sacred places, to memory-rich paths, to regions where certain bones had been buried, certain ancestors had whispered, certain animals had once fallen. The steppe was large, but it was not empty. It was mapped in memory and meaning. This kind of mapping left no visible lines, only echoes, a curved bone half submerged in thaw, a blackened patch of earth, a ring of stones that might once have anchored a hide. And even when a place was not returned to, it was not forgotten. It lived in the songs passed from one fire to the next, in the patterns etched into tools, in the way a shelter was made just slightly larger this time to fit a growing child. So the pressure to move did not erase identity, it refined it. There is strength in stillness. But there is wisdom in motion. To survive, the Ice Age was to understand the necessity of both. You built with what you had. You stayed as long as the world allowed. You watched the sky. You felt the wind. You moved when the time came. And you carried warmth with you not just as fire, but as memory. Because the rings left behind were not ruins. They were offerings to the earth, to time, to the future. And those who walked away from them were not fleeing. They were listening, responding, participating, in a rhythm older than speech and deeper than shelter. In that rhythm, they became something more than survivors. They became keepers of movement. And with every step, they carried the knowledge that a place is not made sacred by staying. It is made sacred by returning and knowing when to go. But they always remembered where they had once stayed. They remembered not as we do, with dates or names or maps, but through feet returning to familiar ground, through choices made in silence, through the simple decision to stop walking and begin again. What kind of memory lives in a place without walls, without fences, without a single mark visible from afar? What makes a human walk for days and still feel the pull of a particular hill or bend in a frozen river? In the mammoth steppe, where distance is blurred and every horizon looked like the next, this question is not poetic, it is practical. Because again and again, those Ice Age families came back to the same clearings. They cleared the snow, they dug the same shallow pits, they placed mammoth bones in rings that echoed the older ones, and they lived once more among the ghosts of shelters past. We see this not through writing but through pattern. In places like Mezherik, Kostenki, and Gonsi, new structures appeared almost exactly where older ones had stood. Post holes overlap across layers of earth. Tool fragments reappear in clusters. Bones from different generations sit in the same soil, separated only by ash and time, and sometimes even the bones were reused. A curved mammoth tusk, once part of a roof, broken and buried, was dug up again, straightened by fire, placed once more into a wall, not because there was nothing else to use, but because someone knew where to look. What does it mean to return to a place that your grandparents once sheltered in? What does it mean when the land itself becomes a map of memory? Some may picture these families as wanderers without roots, but the evidence suggests a different rhythm, a seasonal pulse, a memory measured not in monuments, but in migrations. The reoccupation of Ice Age sites did not happen by chance. The shelters were not placed at random. Their alignment, their reuse, their stubborn persistence through the centuries, all of it suggests intentionality. These were not just convenient locations, they were remembered ones. Perhaps they offered shelter from wind in a landscape otherwise exposed, or access to a frozen river where mammoth herds once passed. Or perhaps they simply felt right, familiar, safe. We cannot know what was said. We cannot know how they spoke about these places. But we can see the result. A site used once is a camp. A site used 10 times, across generations, begins to resemble a home. And so, the mystery deepens. If these places were so familiar, why did they still leave them behind? What made them walk away from warmth, from structure, from a circle of bones carefully built? The answer may lie not just in movement, but in return. The next layer of this mystery asks a deeper question. What if these shelters were not just physical structures, but emotional landmarks? Not every return was about necessity. Some were, but not all. The steppe was wide. The people could have gone anywhere, but they did not. They came back. They chose these specific places, not just because they were good, but because they were known. Familiarity mattered in a world of shifting wind and snow. A slight rise in the land might mean less flooding when the ice cracked. A nearby slope might offer shelter from storms. These were practical details, but they were also inherited memories. In the frozen soil, traces of this inheritance remain. Post holes dug into old post holes. Mammoth bones arranged in rings that almost perfectly mimic earlier ones. Hearths built over hearths. Even the layout of the shelters seems consistent across time. Entrances facing similar directions. Fire pits are placed just so. The geometry of shelter repeated again and again. This was not an accident. It was continuity. And within that continuity, a kind of story emerges. Each layer of soil becomes a layer of intention. Each reused rib or tusk, a line in an ongoing dialogue between generations. Those who returned to these sites knew what they were returning to. They did not come blindly. They came with purpose. Some of the materials they used were not scavenged from the land. They were excavated from beneath it. Old mammoth bones buried in prior structures. Tools dropped in haste or left behind. These were uncovered, examined, and chosen. To reuse a thing is to remember it. And when a new wall rose where an old one had fallen, something quiet but profound occurred. The past folded into the present. This kind of spatial memory does not require writing. It does not require drawings or signs. It requires attention, observation, a collective agreement about the shape of place, and that agreement traveled through time as surely as it did through space. A child who watched their parents build might one day return and build again, not identical, but in rhythm, in relation, the same circle, the same fire, the same shelter from wind. To modernize, the reuse of materials might seem like a response to scarcity, and perhaps it was. But there was more than desperation in these acts. There was care, selection, a sense that this bone, this stone, this curved mammoth skull, belonged in a new story because it had survived an old one. So the architecture of these Ice Age shelters becomes more than structure. It becomes an inheritance. Each camp is a kind of archive, not of things stored, but of places remembered. And these remembered places mattered. They allowed families to begin building without beginning entirely. They allowed memory to anchor movement. And in anchoring movements, they made the steppe feel smaller, not less vast, but more known. The next time they moved, they would carry this knowledge with them again. They would not carry it in their hands, but on the way, they walked. They walked as those who remembered, as those who knew that a place could vanish beneath snow and still remain alive in the mind. They walked with a kind of certainty that comes not from maps, but from repetition. A certainty drawn from cycles. From the knowledge that time does not erase place. It simply covers it. And when the snow melted, when the grass returned, when the mammoth herds began their slow procession north, they would return. They would find the bend in the river, the dark stone near the stream, the way the light moved across the plain at dusk. And in those quiet clues, the old circle would emerge again. Sometimes nothing would remain above ground, just soil and wind, but they would dig. And as they dug, they would find it. A fragment of hide hardened by frost. A post hole filled with ash. A tusk whose root still curved into the earth like a question mark. They would not speak of it as discovery. They would speak of it in return, because the land was not just space. It was a story, and each family knew the part of the story that belonged to them. In some places, bones were stacked more densely, hides stitched more carefully, fire pits blackened deeper into the ground. These were signs of places visited often, places made thick with time. Where this thickness settled, the shelters changed. They became more than temporary. Some bones were driven deeper into the ground. Structures were sunk, anchored, reinforced. Walls grew thicker. Entrances are more defined. It was as if each return made the place more certain, more permanent in its impermanence. To dig a post hole is to say you will stay. If not forever, then long enough. To reuse a post hole is to say you have been here before, and will be again. So even as the world shifted around them, even as ice advanced and retreated, even as herds moved, rivers changed course, storms rewrote the land, the memory of place endured, and it endured not in grand monuments, but in small choices. Repeated, in the angle of a wall, the placement of a hearth, the return to a familiar hollow in the ground. They did not build cathedrals, they built circles, and they came back to those circles, again and again. The people of the steppe lived with motion in their bones, but they also lived with anchor points, places that grounded their lives, places that reminded them who they were, not with words, but with arrangements, with gestures made in bone and ash. And so the place became a memory, and memory became structured, and the structure became home, even if only for a season. That season left marks no storm could fully erase. Though the winds howled and snow drifted high, though animals passed and years slipped silently past, the old circles remained. Beneath the topsoil, beneath the frost, beneath the silence. And when families returned, they did not start over. They began again, in the same direction, with the same intent. They used what could be found nearby, but they also uncovered what had once been part of something older. Bones were not just taken from the hunt, they were reclaimed from the earth, pulled from the ruins of what had been built before. A shelter, like a memory, did not vanish when it fell. It changed form. A wall might collapse, but the ribs that once shaped it could still be used, could still stand again. And in this way, the Ice Age family did not just survive winter. They re-entered it, with knowledge layered like sediment, with craft passed down not in words, but in gestures. Where to place a support beam, how to align the hides, when to bury the fire pit deeper for better draft. These lessons were embedded in the structure itself. The structures grew wiser over time, more adapted, more attuned to the place they stood. Not larger, just better, improved by memory, sharpened by return. Some shelters show signs of internal partitions, walls within walls, separate zones, sleeping areas set apart from tool-making spaces. Fire placed not at the center, but slightly offset to direct the smoke. This was not random, this was a memorable function. The space inside the circle was organized because it had been lived in before. And in that prior living, something had been learned. A certain arrangement worked better. A certain path between hearth and entrance stayed clearer. A certain shape of roof made the dripping less constant, so when the bones were raised again, they followed those rules, not rigidly, but respectfully, as if the memory of shelter itself whispered back. The very ground had become a teacher, and the families that returned listened. This rhythm of return added a kind of layering to the land, not visible from above, but palpable beneath the surface. Dig in the right place, and you would find not one shelter, but many, collapsing into each other, rising out of each other, bone pressed into old bone, ash into old ash, each new generation folding itself into the same shape, with new hands, but old intentions. And so we see something more than survival, more than movement. We see memory rooted in earth, rooted not in permanence, but in recurrence, the way a melody repeats, the way a footpath forms by walking. The shelters of the Ice Age were not frozen moments in time. They were living traces, shifting, evolving, and yet always circling back. returning, remembering, rebuilding, and as they did, a deeper form of knowledge quietly emerged. A knowledge not of how to live anywhere, but how to live somewhere. Somewhere that was never quite the same, yet always somehow familiar. Somewhere that held the echoes of those who had walked before. Somewhere that did not belong to any one family, and yet belonged to all who remembered. There is power in place. Not the power of ownership, but the power of recognition. To return to the same ground again and again is to form a relationship. The land is not merely used, it is engaging, cared for, listened to, changed gently, over time, by human hands and choices. In the circles built of mammoth bone, we see this relationship in its quietest form. The reused tusks, the layered hearths, the carefully recleared spaces. These are not grand gestures, they are small ones. But they accumulate, and what accumulates becomes meaning. Perhaps the children who grew up in one shelter would later bring their own children back to the same rise in the plain. Perhaps they would smile at the way the wind moved across the grasses in the same direction. Perhaps they would feel not lost, but found. Because memory, in these Ice Age lives, was not abstract. It was physical. It was the curve of a femur set just so. The blackened stones of a fire once kept alive through a bitter night. The small impressions in soil where a hide had sagged and gathered warmth. It was these details that tethered families to the places they returned to, and so, over generations, the land became thick with memory. No monument marked these places. No sign told the story, but the story was there, told in circles, told in bone, told in silence. There may have been songs once, shared around the fire, stories about the animals, about the storms, about the times the fire almost went out and someone saved it. These songs may be gone now, but the shelters remain, not in their full form, but in their outlines, etched into the earth by repetition. The Ice Age was not kind. It did not reward sentiment, but it did reward knowledge, and knowledge lived in places. To remember where a shelter had stood was to remember how to build again, and how to begin again, with fewer mistakes, with more strength, with more care. Each return was both a homecoming and a reckoning. What had been left behind, what had been lost, what still remains, and always the quiet work of hands, clearing, digging, placing, binding, lighting the fire once more. In these acts, the memory of place was kept alive, not through writing, not through speech, but through the rhythm of doing, and in that rhythm a kind of resilience emerged. Not the loud resilience of conquest, but the soft resilience of return. The circle does not end. It comes back, and in its coming back, it carries the weight of those who came before. This is how memory lived, inside the land. They had come back to the same places again and again. They had rebuilt what had fallen, replaced bones, smoothed floors, gathered under the same sky. And then, once more, they had left. What remained was not the firelight or the laughter or the frost-bitten silences between them. What remained was ash, bone, and the cold earth itself. But how much can that earth really tell us? When the last voices fell quiet and the shelters collapsed into time, the ground began its slow work. Seasons passed like breaths. The ice deepened, layers formed. Every gesture, every movement began to settle under silt and loam. And what survives is not the thing itself, not the person or the memory, but a trace. A hair fragment curled in charcoal, a blackened bone cracked by flame, the echo of a shape once moved through snow. And this is where we are left. Not with stories, but with clues. Not with knowledge, but with a problem. How do we reconstruct lives from shadows? Across the wide span of glacial Europe, there are places where the soil has become something like a slow archive. In some of the deepest layers of Mezhirich or Kostenki or Moldova, scientists have lifted tiny stains invisible to the naked eye. One layer might contain carbonized seeds, smudged with the dark memory of fire. Another might hold a fleck of ochre where none should be. At first, these seem meaningless, dust among dust. But under the microscope, a quiet world awakens. Residue analysis, a modern term for an ancient intimacy, has shown what fingertips once touched. Lipids from animal fat, resin from coniferous sap, traces of blood protein on sharpened flint. These are not just chemical signatures, they are the evidence of dinners prepared, tools used until they broke, hides scraped by hands now lost to time. Each one is a forensic whisper. Take a scorched layer of sediment, only a few centimeters thick. In that thin line, there might be 40,000 years of silence. Or it might be one night in winter, when a family gathered for warmth and something in the roof caught flame. The line alone cannot tell us. But when compared to other traces, bone scatter, flint concentrations, the slope of a hearth ring, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a certainty, but a suggestion. The suggestion that someone was here, that they lived, that they burned something, that they left. And still, much is missing. What about the fabric of their clothes? Gone. The timber supports? Dissolved. Their voices? Vanished. Even the majority of the bones have collapsed into powder. What we see, then, is not the full painting. It is a canvas of holes. We are peering at a world through what did not decay, and this absence, this silence in the data, is just as instructive as the finds themselves, because it reminds us what time is capable of. It wears everything down, not all at once, not in dramatic destruction, but in the patient erosion of context. What once was vivid becomes faded. What once was ordinary becomes impossible to imagine. In the Ice Age, a family's life was built on things that vanished. Wood, hide, cordage, breath. These are the materials that leave no skeletons, and yet they shape the experience of every moment. The walls were stretched to hide. The bedding was dried moss. The light came from flames or not at all. All of it is gone now, except for what those things touched. A soot-blackened stone, a scratched antler, a depression in the earth shaped like a bowl. What survives 20,000 winters is rarely what mattered most. What survives is what the cold could not break, and what the ground did not digest. Bone and flint, firestone and ash. If a structure was dug in, its outlines might remain. If something was burned, its heat might still be felt in the soil. But the people themselves, their thoughts, their gestures, their memories, these are gone. So we follow traces. In one place, a single mammoth scapula sits upright in a pattern of others, the only one showing signs of having held weight, a load-bearing bone. In another, a few pebbles ring a shallow depression, and in the middle, a scatter of carbonized particles suggests an old hearth. Around it, no more than a meter away, lies a cluster of blade fragments, each retouched, each reduced. The final stages of tools used until there was nothing left to use. In these arrangements, we see design, not abstract design, but the design of living, where you sit to eat, where you place your tools, where you sleep. These are spatial decisions, even when you do not speak them aloud. And across many sites, even with thousands of years between them, there are rhythms that repeat. Fires in the center, cutting tools to the side, refuse push to the edge. Footprints, when they are preserved, show walking paths between these zones. So the question emerges, is this culture, or is it simply human? Was this how these families were taught to arrange space by others who came before them? Or is it how the body responds when placed in a round shelter with cold wind outside? That is the tension between evidence and inference. The marks on the earth tell us where something was. They tell us how many times a blade was sharpened. They tell us where the fire sat today. But they do not tell us why. Why this place? Why this season? Why did they stay this long? Why did they leave? These questions hover, and still, the shelter outlines keep appearing. The same bones in the same circles. The same ash in the same hearths. The same ghost-like footprints near the same soot-dark stones. That is the shape of the knowledge we are left with. A circle half visible in frost. A pattern too consistent to be chance. A whisper across time that says only this: they were here. But to say more, we must speak about probabilities. What makes this difficult is not only what has been lost, but what never leaves a mark at all. Words do not fossilize. Laughter leaves no trace. There is no sediment layer for warmth shared between bodies. So what we know is built from remnants, partial truths, the data of what endured. And yet it is from these fragments that meaning must be drawn. Radiocarbon is one of the few clocks that still ticks. Organic materials, if preserved, hold within them a record of times passing. Not exact, not pristine, but bounded. A burned bone or a piece of charcoal, lifted from the soil and measured, can give us a number. 22,000 years ago. Give or take a few centuries. In a world where nothing else speaks clearly, even that uncertainty is a form of clarity. It tells us that someone set a fire there while ice rimmed the edges of the world. But not all materials yield to that kind of questioning. Stone does not decay, but it also does not tell time. It can be shaped, knapped, struck. It can be worn down or buried. But it will not tell us when or why. Only that someone's hand was once upon it. And so our picture of the past is tilted. Overrepresented by what is silent, underrepresented by what once pulsed with life. So we learn to read differently. A groove on the edge of a mammoth bone might reveal where a hide cord bit into it. A shiny polish along a flint blade might suggest repeated use on soft material. Wear patterns, examined closely, show whether a tool sliced meat, carved wood, or scraped skin. These distinctions are small, but together they let us reconstruct habits. Not thoughts, but movements. Not dreams, but actions. And sometimes actions are enough. A ring of mammoth jaws, half sunken, arranged with apparent care. A series of post holes aligned toward prevailing wind. A cluster of tools all made from the same flint core, used in the same season, and left beside the same hearth. These are not accidents. They are not chance distributions of debris. They are the result of decisions made in a world of necessity. Every placement, every act of construction, every moment of use was guided by need. And then comes the silence. The sediment settles. The wind smooths the ruins. Snow melts and snow again. Generations pass. And still, some sites are returned to. Old ash is cleared. A new fire is laid. And the circle is drawn again. So we must ask, why return? Perhaps the ground held memory. Perhaps the bones were easier to reuse than to gather anew. Or perhaps, more simply, it was the only spot sheltered from the wind. The only patch of earth that felt known. We cannot know for certain. But we can observe the pattern. We can trace it forward, from one shelter ring to the next. Across landscapes that today seem barren, these patterns emerge again and again. The outlines of past life. The circles are rarely complete. Most often, they are partial arcs of jawbones, fractured ribs, and isolated post holes. Still, they repeat. In their repetition, they speak, not in language, but in rhythm. It is the rhythm of survival. The same choices are made under the same constraints. The shelter must face away from the wind. The entrance must not be too wide. The fire must sit low and near the center. The thickest bones must carry the weight. Hide must be stretched tight to trap warmth. Stone tools must be kept close, where hands can reach them from the bedding. These decisions are not abstract. They are embedded in lived experience, and once made, they leave traces. That is what archaeologists try to follow, a trail of durable decisions. But beyond the choices and structures and materials lies something else. Something harder to measure. Spatial memory. The sense that this place has been lived in before. That this circle of land remembers you. That the echo of fire once burned here and may burn again. We do not know how they marked their place in their minds. No carved stones, no permanent boundary walls, no writing. But they returned. That is what matters. In some sites, we find layers. One structure atop another, separated by a few inches of soil and hundreds of years. Beneath the hearth of one shelter, the cracked flints of an older fire. Below that, more ash still. And still deeper, the shattered rib of a mammoth long since turned to powder. Did they know what lay below? Did they sense the memory of warmth under their feet? Or was the land simply practical, dry enough to sleep on, protected enough to endure? The shelters, in their design, suggest both pragmatism and memory. Scarcity demanded careful use of space, but the care shown in rebuilding, in reusing, in returning, it hints at something more than function. It hints at meaning. A mammoth pelvis placed as a seat. A ring of stones too small to cook on but perfectly spaced for a child to circle. A groove in the floor where footsteps have passed too often to count. These are not remnants of shelter alone. These are the traces of repetition, of seasons endured in the same place, of the same wind pushing against the same bone wall, of generations layering their lives atop the footprints of those who came before. And in that repetition lies a form of knowledge, a way of moving through a world that forgets, a way of remembering through structure, through placement, through action. This is not architecture for permanence. It is architecture for return, and even return leaves gaps. The cold earth does not remember everything. It forgets the way voices sounded inside those walls. It forgets the small negotiations over where a stone should lie. It forgets fear. It forgets joy. But it remembers pressure, weight, heat. It remembers what pressed into it, what burned upon it, what stayed long enough to change it. That is why the knowledge we build is shaped like shadows. It is never the full figure, only what the light does not reach. We hold a tool and guess the hand. We find a circle and guess the people who once gathered around it. We find cracked stone and imagine fire. We do not know the words they used to call each other, but we know they built circles, that they tended flames, that they left behind not chaos but patterns, that they turned bones into homes and fire into memory. These truths survive because they are rooted in the material, but the rest must be inferred. How many people slept beneath those hides? What stories were told while the wind howled? Who was first to rise when the smoke thinned? These answers are not in the soil. They are in us, in our capacity to wonder, to reconstruct not just tools and timelines, but ways of being. This is the edge of what can be known. Where fragments end, imagination begins. Not fantasy, not fiction, but informed empathy, the discipline of building truth out of evidence and silence alike. Each bone circle is both a ruin and a question. What did they see when they looked out at the white horizon? What did they believe waited beyond the last ring of stone? What mattered enough to carry? What was left behind? The earth is quiet on these things, but even silence has shape. The absence of children's toys tells us something. The absence of burial tells us something. The absence of waste heaps, of ritual objects, of barriers, of pathways. These are the silences we read like text, and still the soil surprises. A single strand of hair preserved in ice, a flake of ochre caught in a mammoth's socket, a shard of shell from hundreds of kilometers away. Each new discovery adds one note to a long, quiet song, the song of people who lived in deep time, who endured what could not be changed, who burned what they had to stay warm, who built rings that echoed with life, then walked away. What we hold now is not their memory. It is only its outline, made of bone, fire, dust, and time. And it is enough, because it tells us that they were here, and they stayed long enough to leave a trace. But the trace is not random. The more closely we look, the more a quiet order begins to emerge. Not just bones scattered in the snow, not just hearths hidden in ash, but forms, lines. Entrances turn to the east, rings where tusks bend and ribs rise. The shelter was not just built, but arranged, which raises a question that is both technical and philosophical. What does the shape of protection tell us about the people who made it? Across glacial Europe, where the steppe was wind-raked and bare, where trees were distant or gone entirely, circles became shelter. The bones of mammoths and the hides of beasts were not stacked carelessly but placed with intention. And across time, that intention repeats. Even across great distances, in places like Mezhyrich and Dobranichevka, the entrances of mammoth bone dwellings often open to the southeast or east. Not always, but often enough to notice. Why face that direction? There are many theories. One is practical, that the eastern sun brought the first light and warmth of day, a benefit worth capturing. Another is psychological, that orientation provides rhythm, a consistent signal of morning. Others have wondered about ritual. If east meant more than warmth, if it pointed toward renewal, toward movement or migration. But whatever the reason, these entrances were not random gaps. They were passages, framed between tusks, sometimes supported by jawbones, or long ribs that arched like beams. The circle of the house was not broken carelessly. It was opened, like a threshold, and the ring itself, the most persistent form. Again and again across sites, we find circular or oval ground plans, not angular, not rectangular, circles. Why? The answer may lie in efficiency. A circle encloses the largest possible interior space with the smallest perimeter. That means less exposure to cold air, less surface area to lose heat, and fewer materials needed to form the wall. In a landscape of scarcity, efficiency is not a luxury. It is survival. But perhaps the circle did more than hold heat. Perhaps it held memory or meaning. because these were not just cold people solving engineering problems. They were humans, with ideas, with associations. The circle may have been the shape of the hearth, the shape of the gathering, the shape of sitting and speaking and sharing warmth in the dark. Perhaps to draw a ring was to enclose not just bodies but connection. Inside these rings, we sometimes find patterns. A hearth in the center, smaller bones along the perimeter, evidence of work zones, tool fragments in clusters. These are not just signs of living, they are signs of a lived logic, a kind of spatial intelligence, passed on, taught, perhaps even ritualized. Protection was not just a wall, it was geometry, and within that geometry, we can begin to trace a kind of Ice Age architecture, a language of form written in bones, that still whispers across the ages. Even the placement of fire holds its own logic. In many shelters, the hearth is not pressed against the wall, not hidden at the edge, but placed near the center. It anchors the space. Its warmth radiates outward in a circle. Just as the structure itself gathers inward, fire becomes the axis around which life turns. The fire's placement tells us more than how people warmed themselves. It tells us how they organized their world. Around this embered core, families cooked, Saturday, spoke, slept. It was the point of maximum heat, but also the point of maximum togetherness. The shape of protection was not just about shielding from wind, it was about closeness, cohesion, and yet, the circle was never rigid. Some shelters bend in slight ellipses, others cluster in pairs. At certain sites, rings of bones form adjacent ovals, as though two households had leaned toward one another. Like neighbors, or kin. The geometry flexes, but it does not disappear, its meaning persists. At times, structural needs pushed innovation. In Mezhyrich, one dwelling uses over 100 mammoth bones. Long bones, skulls, jaw fragments, tusks, arranged to create a wall almost 2 meters high. The layout is not chaotic. The heavy bones support one another. There is a balance of weight, of curvature. Some ribs act as lintels, some as braces. There is tension and compression. There is knowledge. This is architecture under pressure, shaped not by choice, but by constraint. Without wood, they learn to think in tusks, in curves, in the weight of calcium and the stretch of hide. A skill not taught in drawings, but in doing, learned by repetition, passed by hand. The shape of protection was a shape of adaptation. There are signs of flooring too. In some shelters, flattened earth. In others, layers of compacted clay and ash. Not accidental. A level floor is warmer, drier. It shows an understanding of microclimate and of comfort. Even in extremity, they found ways to soften the edge. Some shelters show evidence of drainage, a slight slope, a gap, a line in the soil where meltwater was guided away. These details are small, but their impact is large. They mark the line between a shelter and a trap, between survival and misery. The more we examine these spaces, the clearer it becomes. They were not haphazard. They were not makeshift. They were shaped, deliberately, thoughtfully, repeatedly, not identical, but informed by memory and by experience. The geometry of Ice Age protection was not drawn on paper. It was drawn on land, in response to the wind, Sunday movement, need. And beneath it all, there is an elegance, not of ornament, but of understanding, of people who read the world with their bodies and responded with form, the circle, the entrance, the hearth. These were not decorations, they were decisions, and each decision speaks, and what it says is this: that protection is not only a barrier against cold, it is a way of being with others, a way of shaping space so that life can continue, so that voices can be heard, so that the world, outside and inside, remains in balance. Inside the shelter, the geometry continues. The circle is not only the outer wall, it is the fire, it is the arc of sleeping places, it is the way tools are arranged, how food is stored. The rhythm of the interior is a rhythm of use, of purpose. The shape of protection becomes the shape of daily life. Entrances are not randomly placed. In many shelters, they face east, toward the rising Sunday, toward the place where warmth first touches the land. This was not symbolic only. It was practical. The morning light could melt frost, could soften the air, and perhaps there was more. A way to wake with the day, to align with the great cycles. Openings small enough to conserve heat. Covered with hide, sometimes double-layered. A vestibule formed with bones and stretched skin. Windbreaks built from snow, from piled earth, from slabs of ice. They knew the forces they lived among, and they shaped themselves against them. But shape is not only resistance, it is also an invitation. To enter the shelter is to step into a world apart, a world where the storm falls silent, where time slows, where hands move with care, where the firelight draws shadows on the hide walls. These shapes are not accidents, they are gestures of refuge. In the ceiling, smoke holes, carefully placed, cut to allow escape of fumes without surrendering warmth. Sometimes offset from the fire, sometimes directly above. Smoke stains still remain in the bones. They tell of air that moved, of breath that lifted from flame to sky. In these structures, insulation was layered, hide against bone, snow banked outside. Sometimes grass is stuffed between crevices, ash sealed into cracks. The design did not come from theory, it came from listening, feeling, testing, remembering. It was a language passed not in speech, but in touch. Energy flowed through these spaces, not in wires or pipes, but in fire, in body heat, in the slow burn of dung and wood. They arranged themselves to hold that energy, to waste nothing, to live just within the threshold where cold did not kill. And in this geometry, there is humility. No angles sharper than needed, no lines that defy the land. The circle bends with the wind. The walls follow the curve of the hill. There is no fight, only cooperation. The shape of protection was not meant to impress. It was meant to endure, and so it has, in patterns found in soil, in soot that clings to ancient ivory. In the quiet way, circles return. From one dwelling to the next, from one generation to another, the design persisted, not because it was perfect, but because it worked. The shape of protection was taught without words. I learned by watching, by rebuilding, by stepping once more into a circle and knowing it was home. Not all spaces were the same. Some rings were wide, open, meant for many. Others were close, intimate, just large enough for a single family. Some used heavy tusks to anchor the walls. Others relied on layered snow, on weighted hide. The materials changed. The idea did not. A geometry of life in the deep cold had emerged. The orientation of the shelter mattered, not just to the east, but also to the land itself. Placed near slopes to block wind, near rivers for water, near paths known to mammoths, near fuel, near memory. This was not random. It was attention turned into structure. Sometimes a ring would include smaller rings inside, spaces divided by hide partitions, storage nooks, sleeping areas, fire zones. The layout carried logic. Heat near the center, cold air pushed to the edges. Movement routed through warmth. A body learns to live this way. The fire was always central, but not just central. Balanced. Too close to the wall and the hide would scorch. Too small and the shelter would freeze. It was an art to build a fire that stayed steady, that breathed gently into the space, that lived, as they did, within a narrow line between too little and too much. There is beauty in these choices, because they are not choices of luxury. They are choices of constraint. Every decision made with scarcity pressing close. Every angle and opening was judged by how long the warmth would hold, how quickly the fuel would run out, how the snow would drift across the entrance when the wind turned. The floor was sometimes dug down, a shallow pit carved from frozen ground. It lowered the ceiling, conserved heat. It made the shelter feel sunken, anchored, like a hollow of life carved into the bones of the earth. The cold wind skimmed above it. Inside, the fire breathed slower. This depression became part of the geometry, not visible from afar, but known to those who stepped inside. A place to sit lower, sleep warmer, be closer to the flame. It was not comfort, but it was survival, and it was shared. The circular layout allowed people to face one another, no corners to hide behind, no long corridors, just a curved presence, eyes meeting across the flame, stories told from mouth to ear with no echo, movements choreographed in spirals. This was a space for attention, for watching, for being watched. And so the shelter was more than protection. It was participation. It asked for presence. And in return, it offered something rare. A moment of stillness. A pause in the long struggle through snow, through hunger, through wind that never stopped. Inside the shelter, the storm became a distant sound. The circle held against it, not as a fortress, but as a cradle. Even in silence, the space spoke. It told the body how to move, where to sit, how to fold into warmth. The arrangement of tools along the wall, the skins stretched to catch droplets of melt. The bones aligned not just for strength, but for memory. Every shelter is a language made from necessity. There is no ornament in these places, no carvings on the tusks, no painted walls, no symbols burned into the hide. But this does not mean there was no meaning. The structure itself had meaning. The survival it enabled was the message. Form was a function. Function was reverence. And the reverence was not only for the living, for the animals whose bones gave shape, for the land that offered frozen earth to dig into, for the fire whose smoke was allowed to leave gently through the roof. The shape of protection was a way of thanking, a way of not asking for more than needed, because too much heat would crack the bones, too much space would let in wind, too many voices would shake the stillness. So, everything was balanced, even the rhythm of leaving. Shelters were not monuments. They were not built to last forever. But they did, because their shape made sense, because their logic was gentle, because they gave just enough. And then, when the time came, they were left to sink into the ground, sometimes burned, sometimes abandoned, sometimes returned to. And when another circle was raised nearby or upon the same place, it was not replicated. It was a memory. The shape had been carried, in hands, I thought, in quiet routines passed between parent and child. The shape was not just how they lived. It was how they remembered living. This is not architecture in the way we understand it now. No blueprints, no plans, no words for thermal retention, no calculations of load. And yet, here, in these rings of ivory and soot and hide, is everything architecture is meant to be. Shelter, warmth, a center, a place to speak, a place to rest. Each shelter was a decision. Each circle was a reply to the world. Not a challenge, not a command, but listening, shaping, a soft agreement with the wind. And that shape still echoes, in ruins half buried in loess, in curves pressed into frost-hardened soil. On the way we still gather around the fire. In this way, a circle makes us feel safe. In the long night of the Ice Age, this was the shape of protection, and it held. It was not given freely by the world. It was not offered by the sky or stored in the land. It had to be coaxed, protected, maintained. It had to be built. And in this quiet but relentless task, Ice Age families discovered something that might be the oldest form of resistance. Not conquest, not expansion, but care. But how do you build warmth when the world itself is frozen? The evidence left behind is not grand. There are no frozen palaces, no tall walls still standing, no inscriptions carved into stone. What we have is softer. The black layer of soot settled between patches of ash, the curve of bone shaped into a windbreak, the stains of long decayed hides pressed into the frozen floor. These are not just remnants, they are echoes of a strategy, one that placed endurance above dominance, because to survive in glacial Europe was to engage in a kind of engineering, not with blueprints, not with written language, but with an evolving memory of what worked and what did not, the spacing of mammoth ribs to hold a hide without sag, the angle of a tusk that could catch drifting snow, the placing of a hearth where smoke would flow and not suffocate. These decisions did not come from theory. They came from repetition, observation, painful failure, followed by small success. That is what made warmth a triumph. It had to be made. And then, kept. And then, made again. Some shelters may have lasted a season. Others may have endured for years. Some were returned to. Others vanished without trace. But in all of them, the same effort flickers beneath the surface. An effort not just to avoid death, but to create life within cold, not merely to endure the storm, but to give the children something more than fear. And so warmth became layered, physical warmth from fire, from hides, from breath shared in close space, but also emotional warmth, the warmth of voices in the dark, of tasks repeated together, of memory kept in the arrangement of tools, or the return to familiar ground. These small comforts were not separate from survival, they were part of it. It is tempting to imagine progress as a series of great leaps, but in the Ice Age, progress was often measured in degrees, in the difference between frostbite and sleep, between a cave too damp and a shelter just dry enough, between a night survived and a day ready to begin. And every step of this slow mastery required thought, energy, ingenuity. So, what did this ingenuity look like? What choices did they make to hold warmth in a world that wanted to take it away? And how did the very act of building over and over again become its own form of knowledge? Those are the questions that shape the cold quiet at the end of the world. And the quiet is not empty. It is full of answers, hidden in the frost, beneath the ash, carried in the shape of survival. A bone wall was never just a wall. It was insulation, windbreak, anchor, frame. It was the structure that held the rest together. And in each one, there was a principle at work. Not invention from nothing, but adaptation from experience. Trial and error made visible in mammoth ribs, scapulae, tusks. These were not merely the remains of prey. They were raw material, chosen, arranged, lifted, and leaned until they served a second life. The hides mattered just as much. Stretched across the bone lattice, they became skin again, but this time not to protect flesh, but to hold heat, to block wind, to bend and flex with the cold. Layers of hide created layers of still air. And still air, even more than fire, was the great protector. It allowed warmth to accumulate. It held it in place when the world outside was 30 degrees below freezing. Snow itself became a tool. It was packed along the base, piled into seams, frozen hard to block gaps. What threatened life in the open could be used, in the right hands, to preserve it in shelter. And that was the quiet genius of these builders. They did not fight the cold, they shaped it. Inside the shelter, the hearth was the heart, always central, sometimes multiple. Its position told you where people slept, sat, and worked, where food was warmed, where tools were repaired, where stories may have been told. The soot lines above show how long the fire burned. The reddened earth beneath speaks of heat sustained. These were not accidents, they were decisions, calibrated by a rhythm of life learned from the land. And around that fire, daily life unfolded. Cooking, crafting, feeding the child who cried in the night, stitching a tear in the hide wall before the next wind arrived. The space around the hearth was not ceremonial, it was functional. But in its function, something sacred emerged from the ongoing project of keeping life alive. That effort required more than materials. It required time, energy, collaboration. No single person could build such a dwelling alone. The walls were heavy, the hides are vast, the bones are cumbersome. Each shelter was a communal act, a convergence of knowledge and strength and repetition. It was not simply a place to sleep. It was a place created together. And what was created was more than shelter. It was stable. This stability was fragile. The wind outside could tear a hide loose. The snow could bury an entrance. The fire could choke the air if not vented just right. Every night was a test. Every dawn, a small success. And in this daily tension, the idea of home took shape not as permanence, but as resilience. A circle of warmth against a universe of cold. In this way, building was not just survival. It was a strategy, memory, culture. And each shelter was a chapter in a longer story of how the human mind bent to the problem of ice and made something warm in its shadow. The story of shelter was never just about shelter. It was about thinking forward, about taking the momentary knowledge of a frozen morning and shaping it into something that could be built upon. The fire pit that worked, the bone that cracked under pressure, the draft that crept through the wrong seam, all of it remembered, all of it refined. Each shelter was a lesson, not just in what to use, but how to use it. The angle of the tusk that held weight, the layering of hides that trapped heat best, the size of the circle that kept bodies close without suffocating the air. There were no blueprints, only the memory of hands, of voices saying this is where we place the shoulder bone, this is where the smoke can rise. The shelters changed, not fast, but across time. Openings shifted, support became more deliberate, hearths are more central. One season taught the next. And when the families returned season after season, or year after year, they carried that knowledge with them. in memory, in habit, in the shapes their hands made. They adapted not just to cold, but to change. A storm that broke part of the wall taught them how to reinforce the next. A hide that failed in a blizzard taught them how to double the layer. A child sickened by smoke taught them to shift the fire closer to the edge. These were quiet revolutions, not of invention, but of refinement. Every mistake became the seed of a new method, and so they built smarter. Entrances faced away from the prevailing wind. Walls angled to catch the low Sunday shelters, positioned on slight rises to avoid flood and melt. These choices seem simple now, but each was a result of deep observation, of living in the landscape long enough to know its moods, its warnings, its patterns. This was not technology in the way we often think of it. There were no wheels, no metal, no measurements written down, but there was design, thought. Engineering in the most elemental sense makes the world do what it would not do on its own, bending space and material into something that preserved breath. Preservation was the goal, not of wealth, not of comfort, but of continuity, of the child growing old, of the elderly making it through one more winter, of the fire not dying out when the wind rose at midnight. That was the metric, that was the triumph, warmth, not as luxury, but as life extended by effort. And beneath it all was a shared understanding that nothing lasted forever. The shelter would be dismantled, the bones are reused or buried in drift, the hide would stiffen or tear, but the method that would remain, passed through gestures, through watching, through doing. Warmth was never just heat, it was the visible shape of human thought, a structure made not only of bone and hide, but of foresight, of effort, extended beyond the moment. No creature endures the ice age by accident, and so the shelter, dark and low to the ground, with its soot-blackened ceiling and snow-packed edges, became a testament to something deeper than instinct. It was resilience made material. Inside, the walls held more than warmth. They held memories. A child grew up watching the rhythm of repairs, hearing when the bones creaked in the wind, smelling when the hide needed shifting. They learned the feel of tension in cordage, the look of a tusk that would not bear weight, the difference between silence that meant sleep and silence that meant danger. They absorbed a way of being, a way that was not written, but walked, carried in bodies, spoken at night in soft voices by the fire. Do this, not that. Bring snow to seal the draft. Stack the femurs with the curve inward. These were the instructions that mattered, because they kept the fire from going out, and the fire was the heart. It pulsed low and constant, controlled just enough to avoid smoke, fed with dried dung, with bits of fat, with twigs when found. Every shelter had one. Every shelter had to. Without fire, the shelter was a tomb. With it, it became a cradle. Of meals, of sleep, of stories. They learned to protect it, to keep embers under ash before moving, to relight from a glowing coal rather than start from cold stone, to huddle close on nights when the fire thinned and breath was smoke in the air. The fire became a presence, a center, not only of heat, but of time. Around it the family formed their circle. The shelter reflected that. Its shape echoed the way they lived, not in rows or corners, but in rings, close, turning inward. A geometry that made sense for warmth, for talk, for watching one another's faces, for seeing the flicker of thought across a brow, or the tremble of hunger, or the light of remembering something once lost. And so, warmth spread beyond the fire. It became a gesture, shared food, a hide passed from older to younger, a lullaby, a quiet murmur at dawn that said the storm had passed. These were the ways warmth lasted, even when the fire thinned, even when the shelter leaned under weight, even when snow found its way inside. They endured because they built, and they built because they remembered. Not just the cold, but the answer to the cold. Not just the risk, but the response. And in doing so, they created more than shelter. They created continuity. The line that bridges one winter to the next, one life to another. And in that act of building, again and again, they revealed something quiet but astonishing. They revealed that to shape warmth from cold was not just a skill. It was a form of belief that survival was possible, that the cold could be shaped around them instead of through them, that life could be stretched, held, and protected not by force, but by thought. They believed in shelter, in what it could mean, in what it could carry across time. And time did pass, winters ended, then returned. Generations moved through the same frozen valleys, through the same hard decisions. Should we stay here? Should we go north? Will the herds return? But within those questions, there was a core that held. The knowledge that what they built could hold off the worst of it, that warmth was something they could make. Not steal, not borrow, make. In the deepest cold, where breath froze as it left the mouth, and trees did not grow, and wind spoke in long howls across the plain. This act of making became an expression of who they were. A child might not have remembered the shape of the first fire, or the name of the hand that placed the first bone in the circle, but they felt the shape of the shelter around them. They lived within it, slept within it, grew old remembering the feel of snow packed against hide, the hush of smoke curling above. The shelter held those lives. It held the bones of their work, the touch of their hands, the decisions made under pressure. Every bend of mammoth rib, every lash of sinew cord, every stone ring is placed around a fire pit. All of it spoke, not in words, but in arrangement, in proximity, in meaning layered into shape. This was not just architecture, it was endurance recorded in space. No record was etched in ice, no monument carved. What survived were fragments, cracked bones, blackened soil, a broken scraper under ash. But if one looks not for the object, but for the effort behind it, a pattern emerges. The warmth was visible, the wisdom woven into the act of staying alive. They did not conquer the ice age, they endured it. They shaped the world just enough to make room for breath, for rest, for waiting out the storm. The shelter was not a fortress, it was a reply, a soft word spoken to the cold. We are still here. We still make fire. We still remember how, and that was the victory. Not in numbers, not in conquest, but in warmth that lasted the night, in a fire that stayed lit because hands passed the knowledge down, because someone learned where to stack the ribs, when to close the flap, how to mend the hide, where wind slipped through, because care was carried forward. So, when the snow fell hardest, when the sky dimmed and the mammoths moved on, and the dark stretched longer than thought possible, they still lit the fire, they still made the shelter, and they still held each other close, because warmth was the victory, and they had won. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice and warmth, for tracing the shape of shelter as a quiet act of survival. If this story gave you a sense of stillness, or sparked a question you had not asked before, or reminded you that endurance can be an art, then thank you for letting it reach you tonight. I wonder what image you will carry into the dark. The ribs of a mammoth forming a ring, the hush of smoke drifting through the hide, or the feel of hands shaping warmth against extinction. Whether it was the curve of ancient bone bent into shelter, the flicker of fire lit again and again, or the shared hush of families enclosed in smoke and thought, these moments linger and connect us. If one of those moments stayed with you, feel free to leave a trace of it in the comments as a quiet offering, a thread in this growing web of fellow listeners. And if you would like to keep following these long echoes into deep time, consider subscribing, because there are still stories left in the frost. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,